Chapter 1. A World on the Edge. Long before the Knights Templar were born, the city of Jerusalem called out like a distant echo. For centuries, it had drawn the faithful from across the world, not for riches, not for conquest, but for something quieter, something sacred. In the minds of medieval Christians, Jerusalem was not just a place on a map. It was heaven on earth, a city touched by God, to walk where Christ had walked, to pray where he had wept. This was no ordinary journey. It was a path of deep surrender. But the road to the Holy Land was long, and it was not gentle. Pilgrims, both noble and poor, braved deserts and mountains, thieves and sickness, driven only by faith and the hope of forgiveness. They walked with sandals worn through and cloaks heavy with dust, carrying little more than prayers and offerings. Each step was a step toward grace, but each step was also a step into danger. The lands between Europe and Jerusalem were fractured, wild and often hostile. As the number of pilgrims increased, so too did the number of those who would harm them. Bandits, raiders, mercenaries, all waiting along the lonely trails that wound through the Levant. Still, the people came. And they came not just for adventure or for escape, but because they believed that to suffer for the sake of faith was to draw closer to the divine. Jerusalem was not only a place to visit, it was a destination for the soul. And though the Church had long encouraged this sacred travel, it could not protect those who undertook it. The Holy Land may have beckoned, but it did not promise safety. In this growing hunger for connection to something eternal, something pure, the seeds were quietly sown for a new kind of defender, one who would pray with the sword and protect. The journey, not just the destination. Empire and faith in conflict. While pilgrims dreamt of holy soil, the world around them trembled. At the edges of the known world, great empires stood on shifting ground. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty and golden, was fraying at the edges. Its rulers still claimed the legacy of Rome, but the world had changed. Their armies, though proud, were weakened by years of internal strife and battles that left borders in ruins. They watched the East with wary eyes. Across the deserts and cities of the Islamic world, something else was rising, a civilization rich in culture, science, and faith. From Damascus to Baghdad, the Islamic empires flourished, blending philosophy with architecture, mathematics with poetry. Their scholars preserved the ancient knowledge of Greece and Rome while advancing discoveries of their own. In many ways, their world was more advanced than Christian Europe, but this brilliance was not without its own cracks. The Islamic world, too, was divided, ruled by competing dynasties, shifting loyalties, and the ambitions of warlords and caliphs. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, surged westward through Persia and into Anatolia. Their victories unsettled the balance of power, sending ripples across the Mediterranean. It was in this growing tension that faith and empire collided. For European Christians, news of lost territory and mistreatment of pilgrims reached across the seas like a cry for help. Whether those reports were true or twisted mattered little. What mattered was that the holy places were no longer in Christian hands. And in the eyes of many, that meant something was terribly wrong with the world. The Church, once content to guide from afar, began to stir. And as it did, the fires of a very different kind of mission began to burn. The First Crusade begins in the year 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a council in the French town of Clermont. His voice rose not with fear, but with certainty. The Holy Land, he said, must be reclaimed. The faithful must rise. And so began one of history's most sweeping calls to arms. It was not just a war, it was a pilgrimage. A crusade. Urban promised forgiveness to those who would take the cross, a sign sewn onto their tunics declaring their sacred vow. He spoke of sin washed clean, of eternal reward. And in a world where salvation was everything, those words were irresistible. Thousands answered the call. Nobles, knights, and peasants alike. They left their homes and families, gathered their belongings, and marched eastward under banners painted with crosses. They believed they were marching toward righteousness, toward Jerusalem, toward God. The First Crusade was a march of chaos and conviction. It brought with it victories and horrors alike. Cities fell, walls burned. At Antioch, the Crusaders starved and then triumphed. At Jerusalem, they wept and then killed. On July 15, 1099, they breached the walls of the holy city. The Crusaders stood where Christ had once walked. But the moment was not peaceful. It was painted with blood. The conquest of Jerusalem ended not in calm prayer, but in massacre, a moment still stained with grief centuries later. And yet, in that moment of fire and faith, a new kingdom was born, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile Christian outpost in a sea of difference. But most of the Crusaders did not stay. They returned to Europe, their vows fulfilled, their souls cleansed. Those who remained behind inherited a kingdom barely held together, vulnerable, isolated, and surrounded. And the pilgrims kept coming. Now more than ever, they walked those roads. But who would protect them now? The need for protection. The Holy Land was Christian once more, but it was not safe. The new Crusader states, carved from the victories of war, were thin and exposed. They held cities, but not the countryside. They commanded walls, but not the roads. And as pilgrims continued to arrive, often poor, often alone, they faced the same dangers as before. From the port of Jaffa to the sacred stones of Jerusalem, the trails were long and treacherous. Raiders knew those paths. They watched the pilgrims come, and they knew what they carried: gold, relics, offerings, hope. To walk without protection was to invite harm. And the local rulers, though willing, lacked the soldiers to guard every path, every hill, every bend in the road. The church could offer prayer. The kings could offer words. But what the pilgrims needed was presence, guardians who would walk beside them, stand before them, and if needed, fall in their defense. Out of this urgent need came the spark of something new, something no one had seen before. A small band of knights, drawn not by wealth or fame, but by faith, stepped forward. They made a vow, not to conquer, not to rule, but to serve. They would protect the pilgrims. They would give their lives for strangers. They would live not in comfort, but in obedience. These men wore armor over humility. They prayed as monks and fought as warriors. And in time, they would be known across the world by a single name, the Knights Templar. But before they became legend, they were born from need, from danger, from the fragile hope of a world on the edge. Chapter 2: The Birth of a Brotherhood. In the quiet years after the First Crusade, Jerusalem was no longer a battlefield, but it was far from safe. Pilgrims still came in droves, drawn by faith, by longing, by the dream of standing where Christ once walked. Yet between the holy sites, danger still lingered. Bandits along the road, ambushed near the hills. The holy city had been won, but the journey to it remained filled with risk. In the midst of this uneasy peace, a knight stepped forward, not to fight for glory, but to serve. His name was Hugh of Payens. Hugh was not famous. He came from Champagne in France, and though he had trained with sword and shield like many noble sons, something in his heart beat differently. He had a vision not just of war, but of sacred purpose. He saw the roads leading to Jerusalem, and more importantly, the pilgrims who traveled them, poor, old, fragile, afraid. Who would guard these travelers? Who would protect the innocent not with crowns or cathedrals, but with courage and faith? So Hugh did what few others dared. He gathered 8 other knights, friends perhaps, or fellow pilgrims moved by the same quiet fire, and they made a vow. Not to wealth, not to land, but to God and to those who had no shield of their own. These 9 men, nameless to most, of the world at the time, gave birth to something that had never been seen before, a brotherhood of knights who would live not just as warriors, but as servants of the sacred. They had no power, no riches, no grand castle, but they had something stronger, a cause. And from that cause, like a small candle lit in the vast darkness, their order began to glow. In the stillness of those early days, the idea itself was the spark. A knight could serve heaven not only by battle, but by protecting the weak. That was Hugh's vision, a sword drawn not in pride but in prayer, vows on the Temple Mount. The King of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, had no great army to offer them. But he saw in Hugh and his small band something rare: discipline, humility, and devotion. In the year 1119, he gave them a place to call home. It wasn't a palace or a barracks. It was a corner of a ruin, a quiet space near the ancient Temple of Solomon, long since fallen to dust. And there, in that sacred echo of history, the new brotherhood found its name. They became the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or more simply, the Knights Templar. The place itself gave them identity. They were not just protectors of pilgrims, but guardians of something even older, the memory of the temple, the heart of ancient worship. The Temple Mount was more than stone. It was symbol of sacrifice, of divine presence, of holy duty. And now, it was where the Templars would begin their mission. It is said that they lived simply. Their quarters were modest, their meals humble, their days marked by prayer and watch. The world outside was still violent, still filled with danger, but within the shadow of the old temple, these men chose a path that blended soldier and saint. They trained, they fasted, they stood watch over the roads, and above all, they made vows. These were not casual promises, but sacred ones: to live in poverty, to remain chaste, and to obey without question. They were knights, yes, trained to ride and to fight, but now they were also monks, bound by rules older than their swords. They did not wear bright colors or gilded armor. Their lives were plain, but the temple beneath their feet reminded them daily: God does not always choose the mighty, but He honors the faithful. And in that quiet place, between ruin and rising, hope, a new kind of knight, was being formed, one who would carry both shield and scripture. Warrior monks. What made the Templars different was not their weapons. Many had swords, many had horses, What set them apart was the way they lived and the way they died. Most knights of the age fought for land, for lordship, or for family pride. The Templars fought for none of these. They fought for a calling, and they lived by a rule more strict than most kings would dare impose. They awoke early, before the sun, and began their day not with a charge, but with a prayer. Their time was divided, not between feast and hunting, but between worship and duty. Silence was treasured. Humility was required. They shared everything, from their meals to their tunics. A new recruit had to surrender all possessions. The order owned everything. The individual owned nothing, yet they were not cloistered. They were not hidden behind monastery walls. These men trained for war. They learned to fight in tight formation, to ride swiftly across the sand, to hold their ground against greater numbers. And when they went to battle, they did not shout for victory. They prayed for strength. They believed that dying in service of their mission was not a loss. It was an offering not to outsiders. They were strange, monks in armor, soldiers who took no wives, sought no treasures, and feared no death. But to those they protected, the old pilgrim on the road, the mother journeying with her child, they were salvation. When travelers saw the red cross on a white mantle, they knew they were no longer alone. Even in peace, the Templars trained. Even in prayer, they stayed ready. Their hands were rough with calluses, their feet sore from long march, yet their hearts beat with a rhythm few could understand. Devotion not to kings, but to Christ. And in that rhythm, a legend began to form. Across the Holy Land, word spread of men who did not waver, who did not flee, who stood like stone even as arrows flew. They were not many, but they were unbreakable. And in their unity, the world saw something rare, the birth of a new ideal. A symbol is chosen. Every order, every brotherhood needs a mark, a way to be known, even by those who never hear their names. For the Templars, it came as a simple design, yet one that would echo through centuries. A white cloak, clean and unadorned, and upon it a red cross. White for purity, for their vow of chastity, their rejection of vanity, their chosen life of obedience and surrender. Red for sacrifice, for the blood they were willing to spill, not for power, but for those they swore to defend. The cross itself was not elaborate. No gold, no jewels. Just red, bold, honest, eternal. This symbol was more than fabric. It was a message. To friend and foe alike, it spoke of resolve. It told the world that here stood a man who had given up everything: land, family, comfort, even his name. He stood, instead, for something larger, for God, for protection, for faith made real through courage. When pilgrims saw the cross, they felt hope. When enemies saw it, they knew resistance. And when new recruits saw it stitched across their own shoulders, they felt the weight, not just of fabric, but of calling. For once the mantle was worn, there was no turning back. A Templar did not serve for a season. He served for life. The Red Cross became feared on the battlefield, respected in courts, and honored in churches. It stood for discipline, for service, for an ideal that stretched beyond borders. And in time, it became more than a symbol of knights. It became a symbol of belief that even in a world of chaos, a man could choose to be steady, faithful, and good. So began the order, not in riches, but in resolve. Not in buildings, but in brotherhood. Hugh of Payens did not live to see what the Templars would become, but he laid the first stone, and from it rose a tower of legend. Chapter 3. Recognition from Heaven and Earth. In the early years of the Knights Templar, the order was small and often overlooked. They were few in number, with little wealth, no great lands, and no high status. Many saw them as little more than armed pilgrims, noble in purpose, perhaps, but lacking in structure or authority. Yet, in the heart of Europe, one voice began to rise in their defense. That voice belonged to Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most respected and holy men of the time. Bernard was not a knight, nor did he seek war. He was a monk, calm, wise, and deeply devoted to God. People listened when Bernard spoke. Kings listened. Popes listened. And when Bernard spoke of the Templars, he called them something new: the defenders of the innocent, the guardians of the pilgrims, and the sword of the church. To Bernard, the Templars were not just soldiers. They were holy warriors, bound, not by pride, but by faith. He saw in them a new kind of knight, one who fought not for gold or fame, but for the protection of others. In a world filled with violence and greed, Bernard believed these men stood apart. He praised their humility, their discipline, and their quiet strength. He called them new monks, men who lived by a code of silence and prayer, but who would take up arms to shield the helpless. Bernard believed they had been chosen, not by kings, but by heaven itself. In 1128, Bernard wrote a letter, a small book, really, called In Praise of the New Knighthood. In it, he spoke directly to the doubts of the time. He explained that the Templars were not like other warriors. They were pure in heart. Their swords were sharp, yes, but their minds were fixed on heaven. He compared them to the saints. And in doing so, he gave them something no army could win: the blessing of the church, the approval of the faithful, and the trust of the people. With Bernard's support, the Templars no longer stood alone. They were seen, they were heard, and soon they would be officially recognized. The Council of Treux, the year was 1129. In a quiet town in northern France, something important was about to happen. Church leaders from across Europe gathered in a great hall. Cardinals, abbots, bishops, men who shaped the laws of faith, all came together. Their purpose was simple, but powerful: to decide whether the Knights Templar had a place within the heart of the church. This meeting, known as the Council of Treux, would change everything. Until now, the Templars had lived without a clear rule. They followed their hearts, acted with honor, and answered only to their Grand Master and to God. But the church needed more than good intentions. It needed structure. It needed proof that this new order could be trusted and that its mission was holy. At the center of the council stood Bernard of Clairvaux. His voice was calm but firm. He spoke not with fire, but with quiet authority. He told the council of the Templars' courage, their purity, and their sacrifice. He reminded them of the dangers pilgrims faced, and how these knights stood between the faithful and the sword. Bernard's words reached their hearts. And so, the council agreed. The Knights Templar were to be officially recognized by the Catholic Church. They would no longer be a wandering band of noble warriors. They would become an order, bound by law, protected by faith, and held to sacred discipline. The council also agreed that the Templars needed a rule, a written code to guide their lives. It would not be a simple thing, for they were both monks and warriors. but it would be done. From that moment on, the Templars were no longer a question. They were an answer to the cries of the weak, an answer to the dangers of the road, an answer to the fear that had gripped the Holy Land for too long. Heaven had spoken through the council, and the world had listened, a rule unlike any other. Most religious orders had rules that focused only on prayer, fasting, and silence. But the Templars were not monks alone. They carried swords. They rode into battle. They stood watch while others slept. So their rule, the one written after the Council of Tra, had to be different. It had to be strong like a wall around the heart, but it also had to be gentle, like a hand on the shoulder. The rule of the Templars was written in Latin, 72 short chapters at first. Each chapter was like a step on a path, guiding the knight from pride to humility, from selfishness to service. It taught them how to dress, how to eat, how to speak. There would be no rich clothing, no fine feasts, no idle words. Silence was to be kept at all times unless permission was granted to speak. Simplicity ruled their lives, but within that simplicity was a powerful purpose. The rule taught that the knights must obey their master without question. They were to be ready at all hours. If the horn sounded, they must rise, even in the middle of the night, to ride or fight. They could own nothing. Even their horses were not their own. Everything they had belonged to the order, and in return, the order cared for them like a family. They were brothers now, bound by more than blood. The rule also warned against pride. Templars were to walk with bowed heads, speak with soft voices, and remember that they were not greater than the poor they protected. Even in battle, they were to be just. They could not chase a fleeing enemy unless it served a noble cause. They were not to take pleasure in killing. Victory for them was not glory. It was duty. This rule shaped the Templars into something the world had never seen before. They were monks in armor, warriors at prayer. They became known not for what they took, but for what they gave, their strength, their safety, and their souls. The Red Cross becomes law. Symbols have power. And for the Templars, that power came in the form of a simple red cross. Not golden, not silver, not made of gems, just plain red. But that red spoke louder than any crown. It meant sacrifice. It meant blood. It meant the willingness to die for a cause higher than self. In 1147, almost 2 decades after the Council of Tra, Pope Eugenius III made a decision that would mark the Templars forever. He gave them the right to wear the red cross on their white mantles. It was not just decoration. It was law, spiritual law. From that day forward, every Templar would carry that cross into battle and into prayer. The white cloak stood for purity. The red cross stood for martyrdom. The timing was not random. A new crusade was forming. The Holy Land, once secured by the first wave of Christian warriors, had again become dangerous. The call went out across Europe for another holy war. The Templars, already known for their bravery, would now become its symbol. Their red cross became a sign of unity. It told others who they were, and it reminded the knights who they had chosen to become. The red cross became their promise, not just to the church, but to God. A promise to serve, to protect, to never run, and to never turn their blades toward the innocent. It was sewn onto their cloaks, painted on their shields, and engraved on their hearts. And wherever they went, people knew These were not ordinary men. These were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. These were the Templars, with Bernard's blessing, the Church's recognition, a sacred rule, and the Red Cross upon their shoulders. The Templars stepped fully into the world. Their journey had begun in silence and struggle, but now heaven and earth had spoken. They had been chosen, and the world would never forget their name. Let me know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. Chapter 4: Castles and Convoys. The Holy Land was not a gentle place. Between the sea and the sacred city of Jerusalem stretched a landscape both ancient and dangerous. Jagged hills rose from dusty plains, and narrow paths wound between rocky ridges and dried riverbeds. But it wasn't nature that pilgrims feared. It was the silence, the kind that hinted at bandits hidden just beyond sight. For years, travel between the port of Jaffa and Jerusalem had been a journey made with trembling hearts and desperate prayers. The holy places awaited, but the roads were ruled by knives and ambushes, and then came the Knights Templar. At first, they were only a few. Hardened by faith and trained for war, they began riding with travelers who had come seeking God, not with fanfare or glory, but with quiet discipline. They rode alongside families, monks, and barefoot penitents, those carrying nothing but hope and a walking stick. The Templars wore white mantles with red crosses and bore swords not for conquest, but for protection. Their eyes watched the horizon, and their hands rested on the hilts of their blades. They were guardians, not warriors of greed. Convoys began forming under their watch. Slowly word spread among those who arrived at Jaffa's busy docks. If you waited a few days, a Templar escort would lead the way. The timing was not always perfect, but the promise was better than risking the road alone. Dozens, then hundreds, of pilgrims joined the caravans. Donkeys brayed, wheels creaked, and boots stirred dust into the morning air, all beneath the silent watch of mounted knights who rode at the front, the rear, and the flanks. Their mere presence changed everything. Bandit attacks dropped. Local warlords began to avoid roads marked by Templar banners. No longer a gamble of life and death. The journey became a path of awe again, through olive groves, dry ravines, and the long ascent toward Jerusalem's golden light. Where once only fear had traveled, now song and prayer returned. The Templars did not ask for praise. They asked for silence, vigilance, and discipline. They camped in orderly rows, ate plainly, and prayed in the quiet dark before dawn. Their duty was sacred, their mission clear. And for the pilgrims who wept upon reaching the city's gates, the memory of those silent nights would remain as holy as the stones they had come to touch. Stone sentinels as the roads grew safer, the Templars looked beyond the path. They looked to the high places, the cliffs above river crossings, the desert ridges where clouds never lingered, the coastal bluffs where waves crashed against ancient stone. In these places they built, but these were not palaces. These were not towers to display wealth or dominance. The Templar castles were built like prayers carved into the earth, strong, simple, and enduring. Each stone was placed not to impress, but to protect. Each wall rose not for beauty, but for defense. These were the shelters of the faithful, the shields of the roads, the silent watchers of the Holy Land. The first great fortress was built near Jerusalem, a stone keep named to reflect the sacredness of its ground. Others followed in Gaza, in Tortosa, in places where others had dared not settle. These castles did not hug cities. They stood apart like monks in the wilderness, watching and waiting. Some were surrounded by scrubland and thorns. Others overlooked rivers or stood atop bare rock, sun-bleached and lonely. But wherever they rose, they served one purpose: to guard the land from darkness. From their ramparts, knights could see for miles. A dust cloud on the horizon, a caravan in need. A flicker of smoke, a village under threat. These high perches turned every Templar into a sentinel, eyes fixed on the land, hearts rooted in duty. Inside, the castles were clean but plain. A chapel always stood at the center, quiet and cool, lit by the soft flicker of oil lamps. Around it were storerooms, stables, dormitories, and armories, all laid out with discipline and care. No space was wasted, no decoration for decoration's sake. Every arch and column had its reason. Every step led with purpose. Even the wind respected these walls. It passed through arrow slits with a low sigh, curled around towers, and drifted. Down into the courtyards were Templars trained with wooden swords and iron will. The castles were not loud with life, but they pulsed with presence. They were more than stone. They were signs that the land was not abandoned, that faith had hands and shields, that heaven and earth could meet in mortar and mission. Architecture of endurance, the Templar fortresses were not just military posts. They were expressions of belief made solid in stone. Every angle, every wall, every gate held a kind of silent theology. They were temples of defense shaped by the needs of war, but also by the desires of the spirit. For in a world torn by crusade and conquest, the Templars were not just soldiers. They were monks who wielded swords, and their buildings echoed both callings. From above, the layout of a Templar castle was often a cross, the sacred symbol built into the very foundation. Chapels faced east, toward Jerusalem or the rising sun. Towers were not only places to fire arrows, but symbols of watching over the world like the eyes of the divine. Strong walls kept invaders out, yes, but they also kept silence in. Inside the fortress, time felt slower, held in place by thick stone and sacred routine. The materials were chosen with care. Local limestone gave a soft, pale look that shimmered beneath the sun. Builders carved it by hand, stacking blocks that locked tightly without need for excess mortar. Where other castles crumbled over time, Templar keeps held their ground. Some still stand today, weathered, worn, but not broken. But strength alone was never the goal. The Templars believed in a kind of holy resilience, not just brute power, but endurance shaped by purpose. Their architecture mirrored their souls. Straight lines, sharp discipline, simple beauty, no gold leaf, no stained glass. Just form and function, wrapped in faith. Even their stairways spiraled to the right, so defenders coming down would have the advantage with a sword in hand. Even their water cisterns were buried deep, so a siege could last longer than the patience of any enemy. Every detail told a story of planning, of preparation, of quiet trust in something bigger than themselves. Their castles were not meant to outshine palaces or rival the great cathedrals of Europe. They were meant to survive, to shelter, to serve, to stand through storms and sieges as silent reminders of a mission without end, a than-thaud end. Reputation forged in steel, the Holy Land was watching. So were the cities of Europe. As word spread of the Templars' strength and their stone guardians, a new kind of respect began to form. It was not the admiration given to kings or popes. It was deeper, quieter. It was the kind of trust that grows from proof, not promise. Locals began to call on them, not just for war, but for wisdom. Farmers asked for protection. Merchants requested safe passage. Even rival nobles began to think twice before acting against a region held by the Templars. Their discipline became legendary, their order unshakable, and behind it all, a code: protect the weak, serve the faith, take nothing for themselves. Unlike other armies, they did not loot, they did not boast, they did not carve out kingdoms. Instead, they formed a network, roads, castles, watch posts that made the Holy Land feel, for the first time in years, whole again. And that brought pilgrims. That brought peace. That brought a rhythm of life where once there had been only fear. And so their name began to change in meaning. It no longer stood only for knights with swords. It came to mean safety. It came to mean strength without cruelty. It came to mean order in a place where chaos had long reigned. The Red Cross, once a strange symbol to outsiders, became a mark that opened doors, quieted disputes, and steadied hearts. The Templars did not celebrate. They trained, they prayed, they built, and they waited. But in that waiting, the world changed. They were no longer just a few knights in white. They were a force, a presence, a story being written not in books, but in footsteps on stone roads, in walls that rose against the sun, and in the silent faith of those who believed that goodness, when guarded with courage, could endure anything. And in the quiet hush of twilight, when the desert wind softened and stars returned to the sky, one could still hear it. The slow tread of hooves on stone, the creak of armor, the whisper of a banner in the wind. The guardians had come, and they would not leave easily. Chapter 5. Lords Beyond Kings. In the heart of the medieval world, power flowed from the top down. Monarchs ruled their lands, lords bent the knee, and everyone answered to someone above. But the Knights Templar were different. From the moment they were formally recognized by the Church, their position was unusual, even unsettling. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a powerful decree, Omni Datum Optimum. This papal bull granted the Templars privileges no other order had known. They were placed directly under the authority of the Pope, bypassing kings, bishops, and even local clergy. No taxes. No interference. No need to obey any earthly ruler except the Holy Father in Rome. To the kings of Europe, this was both a blessing and a threat. On one hand, the Templars were a disciplined military arm of the Church, trained, loyal, and useful. On the other hand, they were now untouchable. A king could not command them, tax them, or try them in his courts. They could pass through borders with impunity. They could collect wealth without oversight. They answered to no crown but wore the red cross of divine authority. In a world where power was everything, this independence was radical. In cities like Paris and London, kings watched carefully. Templar buildings rose beside royal courts, their white mantles moving through streets with quiet confidence. These were not wandering monks. These were men with swords, law, and God behind them. Their word came from Rome. Their shield was papal. And in time, this immunity, though hard won, would make them more than knights. It would make them an institution above nations. Yet, with freedom came burden. They were now more visible than ever. With every exemption came a question: who truly held the power, the crown or the cross on white wool? A new kind of nobility. As the years passed, the Templars evolved. What began as a group of poor knights safeguarding pilgrims grew into a network that spanned continents. With their immunity from taxation and local oversight, they began to amass land-vast estates, vineyards, mills, and villages. Some were gifts from grateful nobles. Others were strategic purchases. Before long, they owned entire stretches of the countryside, from the fields of France to the coasts of Portugal. They built strongholds, formidable commanderies made of stone and silence. These were not castles of kings, filled with music and courtly ceremony. They were built for endurance, not comfort. Yet they stood just as tall, their flags rising against the wind. And unlike most nobles, Templars did not inherit land, they earned it through the order. Their loyalty was not to bloodline, but to rule. Inside these walls, they operated courts of justice, managed peasants, and collected rents. They controlled trade routes, advised princes, and issued loans to monarchs. In the north of England, a farmer might pay his tithe not to a local baron, but to a Templar preceptor. In Spain, a merchant might deposit his wealth into a Templar stronghold, where it would be guarded or even transferred elsewhere safely, efficiently. What emerged was a new kind of nobility. Not born to it, but made. They were no crown yet. Their influence matched those who did. Their hierarchy was internal, bound by vows, not family. No feasting halls. No heirs. Only discipline, devotion, and growing authority. And yet, this authority came with a certain unease. They did not rule as kings, yet lived like lords. Who could balance such power while still calling themselves humble servants of God? Tensions. In Jerusalem, nowhere was this paradox more visible than in the Holy Land. In the Crusader states, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Templars were not just monks with swords. They were political actors. And while they claimed no throne, they sat close to it. Kings came and went in Jerusalem, but the Templars remained. They were guardians of the Temple Mount, defenders of key castles, and protectors of roads that tied the fragile kingdom together. When a monarch was weak or inexperienced, it was often the Templars who held the line. Their network gave them strength, their discipline gave them order, and their allegiance to the Pope gave them legitimacy. But such presence did not always win friends. The kings of Jerusalem needed the Templars, but they also feared being overshadowed. At times, they tried to rein in the order to control its lands, limit its influence, or dictate its actions. But each time, papal protection stood in the way. The Templars, for their part, respected royal power, but only to a point. Their loyalty lay with God and Rome, not with any earthly crown, no matter how sacred the city. There were moments of open tension. Disagreements over strategy, over money, over alliances. In some battles, Templar commanders would refuse royal orders if they felt they conflicted with their mission. In council chambers, their voices could carry as much weight as nobles born to rule. Even among the people, feelings were mixed. To pilgrims and soldiers, the Templars were heroic, a symbol of discipline in a land of uncertainty. To others, they seemed proud, secretive, distant. They wore the same cross as the common crusader, but lived in their own world above kings. Beyond judgment. In Jerusalem, every alliance was fragile, and the balance between crown and cross, between the king and the knight, was always one breath from shifting. An army within an army. As crusader armies gathered for war, the Templars were always there, moving in silence, forming the disciplined spine of chaotic campaigns. They marched in columns, white mantles catching the sun. Their standard, the Beauseant, black and white, fluttered before them. It was not only a banner, it was a promise. Retreat was never an option. Unlike many crusading forces, the Templars did not come for plunder or glory. They were professional, permanent, and fiercely trained. While kings often brought reluctant conscripts or undisciplined nobles, the Templars brought order. They fought as one. They died as one. In battle, their charge could turn the tide. Their defense could hold a breach others could not. Yet even within the larger army, they remained separate. They took orders only from their own commanders. They camped apart. They followed their own codes. To some, this was admirable. To others, it was dangerous. They were an army within an army, a force both central and apart. Resentment brewed quietly. Some nobles grumbled about their arrogance. Others accused them of withholding aid unless it served their own interests. Whispers spread that the Templars were too proud, too rich, too powerful. In times of victory, they were praised. In times of failure, they were blamed, and still the order grew. Their numbers increased, their reputation deepened. They were respected, they were feared, they were envied. In every crusade, their role was vital. Yet they never fully belonged, not to the kings, not to the nations, not even to the armies. They fought beside. They stood at the edge of power, both part of the world and apart from it. Soldiers of God, sworn to no kingdom, bound only by vow and blade. Chapter 6. Money, Monks, and Markets. Far from the roar of swords and siege towers, a quieter transformation was taking place. One that would shape the very idea of trust in a changing world. As pilgrims journeyed eastward through dangerous lands, carrying coin and offerings meant for holy shrines, they found themselves exposed not to enemy armies, but to the shadows along the road. Bandits waited in silence. Desperate hands reached for pouches heavy with gold. For many, the danger was not in reaching Jerusalem, but in the road itself. The Knights Templar saw this. They knew that physical protection, while vital, could only do so much. Travelers needed something more, a way to carry value without carrying risk. And so, a simple but powerful idea was born. The Templars began to offer a new kind of protection. A promise backed not by swords, but by symbols and paper. A pilgrim could leave their money in a Templar house in Europe, in London, Paris, or Barcelona, and receive a document marked with secret signs. That paper, guarded by sacred codes, would then be carried across land and sea. When the pilgrim arrived in the Holy Land, he would present the note at a Templar commandery and receive the same value, now in local coin. The traveler's journey was lighter, safer. The paper could not be stolen the way a purse could. Its meaning was hidden. Its protection divine. In time, these early letters of credit became the foundation for something remarkable, a financial system that stretched across continents, bound together not by profit alone, but by faith. In an age when most could not read or write, The Templars created a system rooted in trust, not only in God, but in each other. These quiet documents, signed in secrecy, guarded in stone houses, made it possible for merchants, nobles, and pilgrims to move money across great distances. In doing so, the Knights Templar didn't just defend roads. They reshaped the roads of commerce, and with them, the rhythms of medieval life. The vaults of Paris, at the heart of this growing system, stood a building of stone and silence. In the city of Paris, near what would one day become the Place de la République, the Templars built their western headquarters, the Temple. It was more than just a house. It was a fortress, a sanctuary. And deep within its walls were vaults that held more than gold. They held trust. The temple became a treasury not just for the order, but for kings. Monarchs placed their fortunes in its care, knowing that few places were safer. Its guards were not mercenaries. They were monks who had taken sacred vows. They answered not to crowns, but to the cross. Inside, every coin was counted, every seal recorded. Chests were locked behind doors that only a few could open. No one man held the full key. Kings of France, England, and beyond began to rely on the Templars as their financial stewards. When King John of England feared theft, he placed his crown jewels under their protection. When Louis VII of France needed to prepare for his crusade, he turned to their vaults. The Templars kept not only money, but detailed ledgers, early. Forms of accounting far more precise than most royal treasuries could offer. Their administrative practices were quiet and exact. Scrolls were inked with numbers. Property records stretched across parchment like veins through a living body. Each estate, each gift, each loan, all was written down. The monks did not speak of these things outside their halls. Their silence, like their stone vaults, became another kind of protection. In time, the Temple of Paris grew into something more than a treasury. It became a place where kingdoms met quietly, where debts were settled without blade or battle. Beneath its high walls and dim lanterns, the financial heart of Europe began to beat, steady, disciplined, and unseen. A global network, but Paris was only one piece of the web. From the Scottish Highlands to the sunlit fields of Cyprus, Templar houses sprang up like outposts of a hidden empire. Each one was connected, not by roads or armies, but by purpose. These were the commanderies, the backbone of the order's growing reach. Some were grand estates, others were humble halls. All were tied together by the same rule, the same prayers, and the same disciplined systems. This network of commanderies allowed the Templars to move resources swiftly. Grain could be shipped from a farm in Burgundy to feed soldiers in Acre. Horses bred in Spain could arrive weeks later in the stables of a fortress in the Levant. Money flowed too, quietly, in the background, through channels known only to those within the order. Each house served its region, yet none stood alone. Orders came from the central leadership. Decisions were made with the whole in mind. It was a system both spiritual and logistical. And while most medieval institutions were bound by borders or kings, the Templars answered only to the Pope and to one another. This gave them a freedom no merchant guild could match. They crossed frontiers without paying tolls. They bypassed corrupt officials. They could store wealth, carry news, and offer aid wherever they were needed. Even in times of war, their network remained intact. Castles fell, armies scattered. But the Templar roots, the documents, the exchanges, they continued. In the eyes of some, it was a miracle. In the eyes of others, it was dangerous. For what began as a chain of protection had become, quietly, the first true international economy. The Templars, without meaning to, had created something that transcended feudal systems, a world connected not by kings, but by quiet trust, riches with a purpose. It would be easy to see the wealth of the Templars and mistake it for greed. Their lands stretched across Europe, their vaults overflowed, their ships carried goods, gold, and grain. But the men who wore the white mantles with red crosses did not own these things. They had taken vows of poverty. They ate simple meals, slept on hard beds, and prayed by candlelight. The riches they gathered were not for themselves. They were for the mission, for the Holy Land, for the wounded, for the lost. Every estate, every farm, every coin collected in distant lands was meant to serve a single goal: the defense of Christendom and the protection of pilgrims. Their money paid for, roads to be patrolled, for castles to be built, for ships to carry supplies to besieged cities. And when crusades were called, the Templars were often the first to answer because they had the resources to move quickly. Their wealth became a tool of readiness, not luxury. Even the banking services they offered, the deposits, the loans, the transfers, were not done for profit alone. They filled a gap left by weak monarchies and untrusted institutions. In many ways, they became the caretakers of stability in a world that often tilted toward chaos. But this wealth, however carefully held, brought danger too. It drew the gaze of envious rulers. It invited questions from those who could not understand how men sworn to poverty could command such treasure. And though the Templars believed their purpose was clear, not everyone agreed. For now, though, the order stood tall, not just as warriors, but as guardians of a fragile economy. An economy built not on gold alone, but on discipline, silence, and sacred duty. In the stillness of their strongholds, as candles flickered and ledgers were closed for the night, the Templars continued their quiet work. And in doing so, they quietly changed the world. Chapter 7. Ships of the Cross. Along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, where the sea rolled in gentle rhythm against stone walls and wooden piers, stood the great port of Acre. It was not just a city, it was a gateway. For pilgrims, it was the first breath of the Holy Land. For merchants, it was a crossroad of spices and silk. And for the Knights Templar, it became something far more strategic. Acre was their anchor, their harbor, their heart of movement and command. After Jerusalem fell and the tides of war began to shift, the Templars realized something vital. Land alone could not hold the Holy Land. To sustain their mission, they would need to master the sea. Acre offered them a natural harbor and deep waters. With its strong walls and prime location, it became the perfect place for a new kind of expansion, not across plains and mountains, but across waves. Templar builders worked in silence and purpose. Warehouses rose beside the docks, strong and orderly. Slipways were carved to lower vessels into the sea. In the background, bells chimed softly and prayers rose with the morning light. Yet beneath this calm exterior, a quiet revolution stirred. The Templars were not content to ride only horses. Now they would command ships. The port of Acre became more than a fortress. It became a living system. Goods arrived from France, Italy, and beyond. Wheat, wine, wool, timber. Pilgrims disembarked with wide eyes and trembling steps. Soldiers came and went. Messages crossed the waters faster than caravans could ever travel. It was a place of purpose, humming with movement, guarded by men who bore both sword and cross. Even in its quietest hours, Acre never slept. Lanterns swayed on ships moored at night. The smell of salt and fish clung to the air. Black-robed Templars walked the docks, eyes scanning the waves, always watching. The sea had become a second front in their sacred war. And Acre, this simple port with its strong heart, became the anchor of it all. Galleys and Guardians Templar ships were not grand like royal flagships, nor massive like merchant carracks. They were lean, long, and light, built for speed, not show. Their design mirrored their mission: to move quickly, to strike with precision, and to guard without fail. The most common vessel was the galley, powered by both sail and oar, able to maneuver even when the wind turned cold or the tide refused to help. These galleys glided like arrows across the Mediterranean, painted in soft whites or plain woods. Marked only with the Red Cross, they carried more than men or goods. They carried silence, strength, and sacred resolve. Templar sailors were not ordinary mariners. They were trained to pray, to fight, and to row. At sea, they obeyed the same vows as on land: poverty, chastity, and obedience. But they also learned the rhythms of wind and water, the tricks of currents, and the signs of storms on the horizon. Pirates roamed the coastlines in that era, fast, ruthless, and hungry for loot. But when a Templar ship appeared, many thought twice. These were not soft targets. The Red Cross warned of discipline and deadly defense. Templar galleys often traveled in pairs or small fleets, eyes watching each other's sails, hands ready at the hilt. They carried supplies to castles and forts too distant for caravans. They ferried pilgrims to safe harbors. They scouted enemy movements from sea and warned of approaching danger. And when needed, they fought quickly, fiercely, without hesitation. Their presence along the coast was not loud, but it was constant. Like shadows that guarded the waves, even harbors in Europe came to rely on them. The Templars maintained ships in France, Italy, and even the British Isles. Their network of ports allowed them to move money, goods, and messages with astonishing speed. And at each dock from Acre to Marseille, the Red Cross waved not as a banner of empire, but as a sign of trust. These were guardians of the sea, and their watch was long. Crusades at sea. As the years passed and battles shifted, the sea became more than a path, it became a battlefield. In later crusades, when land routes were blocked or under siege, it was the sea that carried hope. And the Templars, already trained and prepared, became leaders in this new kind of war. They used their ships to bypass enemy lines, bringing reinforcements and supplies to cities that had no other lifeline. During sieges, when food ran out and morale cracked, a single Templar galley slipping into harbor at night could change everything. Bread, arrows, medicine, hope, these became cargo more precious than gold. The Templars also escorted other fleets. When European nobles brought their armies by sea, it was often the Templars who guided them, protecting their paths, checking for danger, and ensuring they landed where they were most needed. Their knowledge of the coastlines, tides, and secret harbors made them more than sailors. It made them strategists. Sometimes their ships joined full naval battles. The clashes were not like the stories told in mead halls. They were brutal and close. Grappling hooks, fire arrows, screams swallowed by waves. But through it all, the Templars remained calm. Their ships did not flee. Their men did not panic. They fought as they prayed, steady, focused, without fear. Their naval presence also changed diplomacy. Rulers in Europe began to see the Templars not just as warriors, but as a logistical power. With ships and ports at their command, they could move messages faster than any crown. They could carry treasure more safely than any merchant. In some cases, even kings turned to them for help, not with swords, but with sails. As each crusade rose and fell, as cities changed hands and peace gave way to war again, the sea remained constant, and the Templars remained upon it, not as conquerors, but as caretakers of a dream that the Holy Land could be protected, that faith could be defended, that purpose could still travel on wind and wave. Beyond the horizon, when the Templar order fell and the Red Cross was hunted, instead of honored, many ships vanished. Some were seized, some burned, some simply sailed away into fog, into legend. The records became thin. The names were lost. But the sea, always patient, kept its secrets. In later years, as explorers set sail to find new lands, some carried symbols strikingly familiar: a cross on sail, a vow in heart, a quiet discipline in how they moved. Historians argue over whether these ties were real or imagined, but in ports like Lisbon and Barcelona, old whispers remained. Some said the Templars had taught certain sailors how to navigate the stars. Others claimed hidden charts had passed down through hidden hands. Whatever the truth, something lingered, not just in maps or relics, but in spirit. Templar knowledge, once used to guard pilgrims, may have helped guide explorers toward distant shores. Not for war, but for wonder. The same silence that once filled the decks of galleys outside Acre now echoed, perhaps in the sails that crossed the Atlantic. What began as a mission of protection became, through time, a legacy of direction. Even today, the image of a ship with a red cross sails on in art, in memory, in dreams. It calls back to an age when knights took to the sea not to claim riches, but to carry a cause, when the world was still unmapped, and yet men dared to sail forward, guided not only by compass, but by conscience. The Templars' fleet has long since sunk beneath the waves, but their spirit still drifts upon them, quiet, steady, enduring. The wind that once filled their sails now moves across history, reminding us that true power often travels not in the noise of empire, but in the hush of service. And sometimes, a simple ship with a single cross can carry more than cargo. It can carry a calling. Chapter 8. The Rule of the Sword. Before the world stirred, before the sun climbed the hills of Jerusalem or softened the stones of Paris, a bell rang in the dark. Its tone was low, not loud, but it echoed across the sleeping halls of the Templar commandery. In every Templar house, whether in the Holy Land or the forests of Europe, the day began the same way, in stillness, in darkness, and in prayer. The brothers rose quietly from their straw-filled beds. There was no speaking, only the soft rustle of cloth and boots touching the cold stone floor. They gathered in the chapel, a small room lit by candlelight, where the sound of their footsteps blended with the silence of devotion. The day was marked by 7 sacred hours of prayer, taken from the traditions of older monastic orders. From matins before dawn to Compline before sleep, the hours kept time like a divine clock. These were not moments to ask for glory or victory. They were moments to be reminded of who they were and why they served. Their prayers were whispered. Chants, Latin hymns spoken with slow breath, heads bowed. Even the Grand Master stood beside the lowest knight. Equal before God in that quiet hour. After prayer, the day unfolded not in haste but with rhythm. The Templars did not wander. Each hour had its purpose. Some would train with swords and ride horses. Others would repair armor or care for the sick. But always, the bell would sound again, calling them back to the chapel, back to the heart of their purpose. Their lives were not ruled by whim. They were ruled by the pattern of devotion. At night, while most of the world slept in deep silence, the Templars rose again. Midnight prayers were part of their vow. Even sleep was not their own. It was shared with God. So once more they gathered, cloaked in their white mantles, standing together in the flickering dark. The chapel glowed like a star in the night, and in that light they found peace. Even in a world of war. Silence between battles in the field of war. Where other soldiers might shout or boast, the Templars were quiet. Their silence was not weakness. It was strength, forged by years of discipline. When they marched, they did so with order. No songs, no taunts. Only the steady sound of hooves and armor. Even before battle, when fear might stir in the chest, the brothers spoke little. Their courage did not come from loud voices, but from deep conviction. The rule of the Templars demanded restraint, not only in combat, but in everyday speech. They were forbidden from speaking unless it was needed. Idle words were seen as dangerous, distractions from purpose, invitations to pride. Jokes were rare. Gossip was forbidden. Even laughter was limited, not because joy was wrong, but because it could open the door to carelessness. A Templar's silence was a kind of shield, protecting his mind from the chaos outside. In camp, the Templars sat together in simple lines. Their meals were quiet, taken with heads bowed and hands folded before the first bite. There were no golden plates, no silver goblets, just wooden bowls, bread, and whatever food could be spared. If meat was served, it was without seasoning. They ate for strength, not pleasure. And after the meal, they returned to their duties, sharpening blades, tending horses, reading scripture, always in calm, deliberate motion. On the battlefield, their silence turned into something fearsome. They did not rush. They advanced, like a wall of iron, shoulder to shoulder. When they charged, it was with unity, not for vengeance, but to defend. Their banners did not flap with wild colors, only the red cross, simple and striking. And as they fought, they did not scream or celebrate. They moved with precision, as if each strike was guided by something beyond them. To fight without anger, to serve without pride, this was the silence between battles. This was the soul of the Templar. The armor of faith. Every piece of a Templar's armor had meaning. Nothing was worn for beauty. Nothing was chosen for pride. From their plain white cloaks to their iron helms, the rule guided what they could wear and what they could not. Their clothing was simple yet sacred. The white mantle, given only to knights, symbolized purity. The red cross, sewn near the heart, was a badge of sacrifice, a reminder that they were willing to die, not for glory, but for others. Underneath the cloak, they wore chainmail, heavy rings of iron linked together. It was strong but not flashy. No gold, no jewels, just the sound of metal moving like water over the body. Their belts were plain leather. Their boots were worn but well kept. Even their gloves were simple cloth. There were no personal touches, no colors to set them apart. Every brother looked the same, not because they lacked identity, but because they shared it. Their weapons, too, were chosen with care. The sword was the most sacred. It was not just a tool of war. It was a symbol of justice. A Templar's sword was to be used only when needed and never out of anger. Their shields bore the red cross, but no family crest. No names. They were not fighting for themselves. They were fighting for a cause. The rule even told them how to wear their hair and beards. Heads were to be shaved on top like monks. Beards were to be full, not trimmed for style. They were to be clean, but not vain. Their bodies, like their armor, were to be treated as instruments, not for show, but for service. This strict control may seem harsh, but it gave the Templars something rare: freedom from pride. They did not worry about fashion or rank. They did not compete for attention. Instead, they moved as one, a single body of faith wrapped in iron. And in that unity, they found peace. Obedience unto death. The final pillar of Templar life was obedience, deep, unwavering, complete. A Templar's will was not his own. When he joined the order, he gave up his freedom. He handed over his desires, his choices, even his future. In return, he gained something greater: purpose, a clear path, a mission. He became part of something eternal. The Grand Master and those beneath him held full command. If a brother was told to ride, he rode. If he was told to guard a gate, he did not leave it. If he was told to hold a line in battle, even when death rushed toward him, he stood firm. There was no debate, no hesitation. The rule demanded full trust. And in time, that trust became second nature. This obedience shaped how they lived, how they trained, and how they died. In war, it meant they never broke ranks, even when surrounded. In peace, it meant they followed the rule down to the smallest word: how to dress, when to eat, when to speak. Every action became a form of worship because it was done with purpose. Many knights came from noble families where they were used to giving orders. But in the order, they learned to obey. The chain of command was strict, but not cruel. It was designed to protect the mission, to keep every brother focused. There were no personal missions, no solo glory. Only the mission to protect, to serve, and to hold the sacred places. And if a day came when a brother had to lay down his life, he did not do so with fear. He did so with peace, because he knew he was part of something larger than himself. His sword was not his. His breath was not his. Even his death was offered up, an act of obedience, quiet and complete. That was the Templar way. From the first light of prayer to the last breath on the battlefield, every moment was guided by the rule. A life not of comfort, but of clarity. A life of silence, of service, and of sacred steel. The rule of the sword did not bind them. It freed them to live not for themselves, but for a greater light. Chapter 9. The Peak of Power. By the early 1200s, the Red Cross of the Knights Templar flew not just over the Holy Land, but across the very fabric of medieval Europe. Their power was no longer confined to the dusty roads of Jerusalem or the windswept hills of Galilee. From the coastlines of Portugal to the mountain passes of Armenia, the Templars had become builders of fortresses and guardians of faith. Every castle told a story, not of kings or peasants, but of a brotherhood that wielded stone like scripture and steel like prayer. These were not grand palaces filled with music and wine. They were cold, silent, and strong. Each wall was a sermon. Each tower a watchful eye. In Spain, their castles stood firm against the rising forces of the Moors. In the east, they defended the final edges of Christendom with grim resolve. There was nothing elegant about these fortresses, but their simplicity was their strength. Their placement was never random. Built along trade routes, mountain trails, and desert crossings, Templar castles formed a great net, stretching across continents like quiet anchors of control. When pilgrims passed through these lands, they often found refuge within Templar walls. There, among stone chapels and candlelight, they rested without fear. Safe from bandits, warlords, or famine, travelers could sleep under the same roof as knights sworn to protect them, not for profit, but for purpose. These castles, though built in different lands, shared the same spirit. Silent courtyards echoed only with prayer. Blacksmiths worked near chapels, preparing weapons beside holy books. Horses were tended with reverence. Bread was shared in silence. To walk through one of these fortresses was to feel the strange union between monastic peace and military readiness. No matter how far apart the castle stood, they felt connected, like distant chapters in the same sacred book. In their architecture, one could read the rise of an order that had become more than mere warriors. They were symbols now. Their strength, their reach, their silence, all spoke of a brotherhood unlike any other. Advisors to emperors at their height, the Templars were not only guardians of roads and castles. They had become trusted voices in the halls of kings. Their white mantles and red crosses were now seen not just on battlefields, but beside thrones and royal courts. Monarchs who once led crusades with Templar protection soon turned to them for something deeper advice. Templar Grand Masters were no longer just military commanders. They were diplomats, financiers, and counselors. When a crown sought to reclaim the Holy Land, it was often the Templars who helped plan the journey, raise the funds, and decide when to strike. Their knowledge of foreign lands, supply chains, and strategy was unmatched. They had seen every desert, crossed every sea, and heard every whisper. What ruler would not want such a voice beside him? But the Templars offered more than knowledge. They offered stability. In a world where gold was scarce and trust even scarcer, the Templars became the keepers of treasure, not just their own, but the fortunes of kings. Their network of commanderies stretched from London to Acre, allowing rulers to move funds safely across borders. This made them essential. A king could deposit his gold in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem, all under the protection of Templar seals. With this power came respect and danger. The Templars did not bow easily. They took orders from no king, only their own master and the Pope himself. And even the Pope at times found himself relying on their wisdom and wealth. It was a strange place to be, a knight in service of God, yet guiding kings in matters of war, peace, and politics. The line between sacred and secular began to blur. In councils and courts, Templar voices held weight. Their opinions shaped crusades. Their warnings slowed invasions. Their presence brought calm or fear depending on who looked upon them. For the first time, the men in white no longer stood only at the gates of Jerusalem, but inside the very rooms where history was written. They were no longer simply protectors of pilgrims. They were, quietly and steadily, becoming shapers of the world. The brotherhood grows. With glory came attention, and with attention came desire. Young men from noble families across Europe looked upon the Templars not with fear, but with longing. There was something magnetic about their quiet strength, their disciplined lives, their sense of unity. Some saw it as a path to holiness, a way to cleanse the soul in a world full of sin. Others saw it as a door to power, honor, and eternal memory. Either way, they came, in droves. From France, England, and the German principalities, sons of knights and lords left their homes and rode toward the nearest commandery. There, they would knock on the wooden doors and ask to join the brotherhood. The life they entered was not easy. It was one of discipline, silence, and service. A Templar knight did not own wealth, did not marry, did not chase glory for himself. He lived by rule, by vow, and by the strength of the brotherhood around him. Yet this did not dissuade the hopeful. Perhaps it was the very harshness of the life that made it feel more real. In a world of shifting alliances and fragile peace, the Templars offered something steady, something firm, a life that pointed towards something greater than the self. For some, that was reason enough. The order grew. Commanderies expanded. New recruits trained beside old veterans. Every brother, no matter how noble his birth, took the same vow, wore the same simple clothes, and slept on the same straw. They rose together, prayed together, and fought side by side. The sound of their chanting echoed across Europe morning and night. Yet behind that chant was a growing force, one that now numbered in the thousands. Not just knights, but squires, servants, and supporters. The brotherhood had become a vast river, fed by many small streams. Each new voice added to its flow. Each new recruit carried the weight of history and the hope of redemption. And still, they came. Even those who would never ride into battle found purpose within the order. They cooked, taught, repaired, and prayed. The Templar family extended beyond the sword. It was a community, a machine of faith and discipline that stretched across kingdoms. For every knight seen charging across a battlefield, there were 10 more behind him, unseen, unknown, but part of the same sacred chain. The brotherhood was no longer just a military order. It was a way of life, whispers of envy, but as the Templars rose higher, shadows lengthened around them. Power, even when earned, invites suspicion. And in the silent halls of kings, whispers began to stir. They answer to no one but their own, some would mutter. They hold more gold than the treasury, others would say. At first, these were only rumors, small words carried by wind. But as the years passed, the whispers grew louder. Monarchs who once trusted the Templars now found their presence unsettling. How could one group, neither royal nor common, hold such sway over lands, wealth, and warfare? It was not just their independence that bred envy. It was their success. The Templars did not build cities or empires, yet their fortresses endured where kingdoms fell. They did not crown kings, yet they often decided the outcome of wars. 2. Those in power, this was both useful and dangerous. Kings needed them, but feared what they might become. Their loyalty to the Pope also made them suspect in the eyes of monarchs who sought to control church and state alike. And so, the Templars began to face a quiet wall not of stone, but of suspicion. In France, in particular, this unease began to take root. The French crown, deep in debt to the Templars, began to view them less as protectors and more as creditors. And creditors, in times of royal weakness, are rarely loved. Across Europe, envious eyes watched as Templar processions moved through cities, their banners high, their coffers full, their knights solemn and untouched by local law. They were an army without borders, a church within the church, an order that could not be bought, broken, or bent. Such things do not go unnoticed. The world that had once lifted the Templars to glory now began to turn, slowly, quietly, like clouds gathering over a bright plain. The brotherhood remained strong. Their castle still stood. Their prayers still rose like incense. But in the distance, a different wind began to blow. It carried not praise, but questions. And questions, when asked in the ears of kings, can shape the future like hands shaping clay. The Templars, so long at the heart of Christendom's hopes, had reached the height of their power. But as any tower knows, the higher it rises, the more it feels the storm. Chapter 10. The Fall of Jerusalem. In the soft heat of a July morning in the year 1187, the hills of Galilee shimmered under a quiet golden sky. But beneath that silence, thousands of soldiers prepared for battle, tired, thirsty, and marching toward disaster. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Lusignan, carried with it the hopes of a fragile kingdom. Among them rode the Knights Templar, armored, solemn, and bound by duty. They knew what was coming, but they did not turn away. Days earlier, they had left the safety of their fortresses to answer the call of battle. Saladin, the powerful Muslim leader, had laid siege to the fortress of Tiberias. In haste and heat, the Crusaders crossed the dry plains to meet him. But Saladin was not just a warrior, he was a tactician. He cut off their access to water, led them into open ground, and watched as fatigue and thirst withered their strength. By the time two armies met near the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin. The Crusaders were broken. Their mouths were dry, their spirits dimmed. Smoke from grass fires filled the air, and the sun showed no mercy. Saladin's forces surrounded them. The Crusaders tried to hold the line, but it was no use. One by one, their banners fell. Templar knights fought fiercely, protecting the sacred relic they carried, the true cross, but it too was captured. Many were killed on the field. Those taken alive faced a grim fate. Saladin, unlike others before him, did not slaughter everyone. But the Templars, known for their relentless defense and refusal to surrender, were treated differently. Most were executed, not out of cruelty, but as a warning. The Battle of Hattin was more than a loss. It shattered the core of the Crusader forces. The armies of Christendom had been crushed, and with them, the last strong shield around Jerusalem began to crack. The road to the Holy City was now open, and Saladin was ready to walk it. The city. Lost Jerusalem stood quiet in the months that followed, holding its breath as the horizon darkened. News of Hattin spread quickly. Panic gripped the people. The fortresses of the Crusader states fell like dominoes. and by September Saladin's army surrounded Jerusalem itself. Inside the city, fear clung to the stone walls. There were no reinforcements left. The Crusader leaders who remained, knights, nobles, and priests, tried to prepare for the worst. Among them were the surviving Templars, hardened and heartbroken from Hattin, now ready to give their last breath for the city they had sworn to defend. But the truth was clear: they could not hold the city. The defenders were too few, the supplies too low. Still, they did not surrender quickly. They negotiated, they pleaded, and in the end, something unexpected happened. Saladin agreed to a peaceful handover. He allowed the Christians to buy their safety. He showed mercy, a rare thing in the long history of siege warfare. Families sold what little they had to buy passage out. Some were ransomed, others were enslaved. But the massacre that many had feared never came. On October 2nd, 1187, the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, as Saladin saw it, Jerusalem fell, not with a scream, but with a side dot to the Knights Templar. The pain was not just military. It was spiritual. Jerusalem was the heart of their mission, the city they had vowed to protect above all others. The place where Christ had suffered and risen, now lost. The loss did not just shake their order. It shook the entire Christian world. Monasteries mourned. Priests wept. Kings trembled. The idea that Jerusalem, the sacred city, could fall and not be immediately reclaimed was a wound that did not close quickly. For the Templars, it marked the end of something pure. And though they would continue to fight, nothing would ever be quite the same. Retreat to the coast with the fall of Jerusalem, the Templars, along with the remnants of the Crusader forces, pulled back to the coast. There, in the cities of Tyre and Acre, they built new walls and waited. These were not just cities of stone now. They were sanctuaries, clinging to the edge of the Holy Land like ships refusing to sink. In Acre, the Templars began to regroup. Their losses at Hattin had been staggering. Their brothers were dead. Their sacred city was gone, but their order remained. And with it, the discipline that had always set them apart. They turned Acre into a fortress. Stone by stone, they rebuilt. Their presence. Supplies were brought in from Europe. Ships arrived carrying new recruits, men who had taken the vow after hearing of Jerusalem's fall. In Tyre, another stronghold rose. These cities became lifelines, not just for the Templars, but for the whole Crusader presence in the east. But they were no longer masters of the land. They were defenders of shrinking borders. And the question began to echo through the halls of every commandery, both east and west. Without Jerusalem, what was left to protect? The Third Crusade would come, led by kings and emperors. Richard the Lionheart would march. Battles would be fought. Treaties signed. But Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control. The Holy City was no longer a Christian kingdom. And the Templars, once guardians of its gates, now stood watch over a coastline, distant, exposed, and uncertain. Still, they did not falter. They kept their vows. They prayed. They trained. They waited, hoping that one day the gates of Jerusalem might open to them again. A holy wound, the loss of Jerusalem, cut deep, not just into the hearts of the Templars, but into the soul of Christian Europe. It was more than the fall of a city. It was the loss of a symbol, a sacred anchor that had guided thousands. And now that anchor was gone. For the Templars, it created a strange emptiness. Their order had been born to defend Jerusalem. Their prayers had pointed toward it. Their battles had circled it. With it lost, something invisible had broken. They did not dissolve. They did not fall into despair. But the clarity they once carried, the sense of being exactly where God needed them, began to fade. They found new purpose in defense. Of Acre, of pilgrims, of the fragile coast. Their financial network grew. Their fortresses remained strong. But in their silence, there was mourning. Jerusalem had been more than a place. It had been a promise. And though they did not speak of failure, the questions lingered. Could they still call themselves guardians of the Holy Land if they no longer guarded the holiest place of all? Their answer, for a time, was endurance. Keep building. Keep praying. Keep serving. Perhaps the city would return to Christian hands. Perhaps the future held another crusade. But deep down, the Templars had already entered a new chapter, one filled not with triumph, but with memory. And memories, while powerful, are not always enough. The holy wound remained unseen but unforgotten. And in that quiet ache, the long road toward decline had quietly begun. Chapter 11. A fortress under siege. The sea crashed quietly against the cliffs below, and the wind, thick with salt, swept across the battlements. There, high above the shore, stood Chateau Pellerin, one of the strongest fortresses the Templars had ever built. It rose like a stone hymn, half castle and half prayer, carved not just from rock, but from the desperation of a fading dream. For in this late hour of the Crusades, Jerusalem was lost and the Holy Land was slipping away. The Templars no longer advanced. Now they stood still, not in defeat, but in defense. Chateau Pellerin, also called Etlit, had been built after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187. It was not nestled in safety, but perched on the edge of danger. Its thick walls and towers were a final breath of strength along the coast, a beacon of resistance in a land slowly growing quiet. From a distance, it looked unshakable. From within, it felt sacred. The fortress was designed with precision. Double curtain walls, strong towers, deep moats, and hidden wells. Every stone seemed to whisper, "Here, we do not run." Other fortresses, scattered across the land, followed the same spirit. From Tortosa to Gaza, Templar castles were never just walls. They were hearts still beating in the chest of a dying cause. As Muslim forces reclaimed city after city, these isolated strongholds remained, not because they thought they could win, but because they knew they must endure. Inside Chateau Pellerin, the air was heavy with silence. There were no grand halls, no tapestries or gold, just stone, cold, solemn, enduring. Yet within that stone lived hope, the kind of hope that doesn't shout but kneels, that doesn't shine but refuses to fade. The Templars did not believe they could turn back the tide, but they believed in duty. And in places like this, behind walls of hope, that belief held firm even as the world around them fell. Holding the line, the years wore on, and the battlefront moved ever closer. Towns once ruled by Christian lords now flew different banners. Allies grew fewer, supplies grew thinner. And yet, the Templars stayed. Where others withdrew, they reinforced. Where others mourned, they rebuilt. Each castle became its own world. Cut off, outnumbered but never surrendered. Their order demanded obedience, and the brothers lived by that code. Even when word came that another stronghold had fallen, they did not waver. Reinforcements came slowly, if at all. But those who stood the watch did not ask for rescue. They asked only for the strength to endure. Every wall mattered. Every gate was sacred. The enemy might claim the valleys, but the Templars would hold the peaks. They rotated their guards in silence. They trained beneath narrow skies. They repaired what broke, even when hope itself seemed fractured. Every man knew that his post might be the last. Yet not one turned from it. These were no longer crusaders chasing victories. They were defenders standing guard over memory, and meaning dot when siege engines appeared on the horizon. When enemy horns sounded across the fields, the brothers did not panic. They moved to their stations with the quiet of monks and the discipline of soldiers. Arrows flew, stones broke. Fire licked at the outer gates, but the Templars held. Not because they expected to survive, but because they were not afraid to. Each siege was a test, not just of strength, but of spirit. And again, the walls held, sometimes for days, sometimes for years. Some castles fell, eventually. Others, like Chateau Pellerin, never did, abandoned only by command, not by force. The Templars' line was not drawn on a map. It was drawn in their hearts. And it did not bend quiet in the storm within the walls. Life moved slowly. Meals were plain. Prayers were frequent. Training was constant. But there was more than duty here. There was stillness. A strange kind of peace that came from knowing there was no turning back. In these castles, monks lived in armor. Soldiers knelt before dawn. The clang of steel was followed by the soft murmur of psalms. The brothers cared for the sick. They mended weapons, stitched wounds, and read the scriptures. The air was filled not just with the weight of waiting, but with the warmth of shared faith. Even under siege, the chapel candles burned. Even when death stood at the gate, morning prayer was never missed. The walls were thick, but not cold. There was kindness among the brothers, quiet, steady, unspoken. They knew each other's burdens, fears, and strengths. Some had seen loved, ones lost. Others had walked from distant lands to wear the Red Cross. All had given up everything, not for reward, but for something more lasting than life. In the corners of the castle, one might hear humming, soft songs from childhood, memories wrapped in sound. In the early hours, before the sun touched the sea, a brother might be found alone on the wall, staring out, not with despair, but with wonder. The world was crumbling. And yet, something inside them remained unbroken. Their castles became more than fortresses. They became monasteries under siege, sacred spaces where steel met spirit, where defense was a form of devotion. The Templars did not hide from the storm. They sat within it, hands folded, eyes open, hearts steady. Last lights of Ultramar, the land beyond the sea. That was what Europe once called the Crusader kingdoms, a distant place of saints and soldiers. But now, that light was fading. City after city was lost. Kingdoms collapsed into dust. And still, the Templars stood, their red crosses catching. The last golden light of the setting dream. In the final years, the order faced not only swords from without, but doubt from within. Whispers grew louder. Support from Europe thinned. The dream that once lit cathedrals and crowned kings now flickered. But in the strongholds that still held, in those few last outposts of resistance, the Templars. Courage only burned brighter. They knew they were the last, the final guardians of a mission that had begun generations before, and so they stood with grace. Like candles against the wind, they did not flare. They simply endured. In Acre, they fought to the last breath. In Sidon, they defended the towers until they could no longer climb them. And in every place they held, they left behind not just stones, but stories. Even as they withdrew, they did so with discipline. Castles were emptied, not overrun. Fortresses were dismantled, not captured. Their departure was not a retreat, but a farewell, quiet, reverent, like monks leaving a chapel. They had not failed. They had finished. The dream of Ultramar was gone, but the example it left behind of sacrifice, devotion, and unshakable faith would remain. The Templars did not vanish in defeat. They faded like stars at dawn, their light giving way to a new day, their strength still echoing in the silence they left behind. And in that silence, history remembered them. Not for the wars they fought, but for the way they held the line. For the way they lived in stone rooms, prayed in the shadow of siege towers, and stood unbroken even as the world around them fell. Chapter 12. Secrets and Shadows. There was a time when the Templars stood in open fields, banners raised, red crosses shining under the sun. But as decades passed, the very strength that made them holy defenders also made them strangers. Their lives followed a rhythm no one else understood. Their loyalty belonged to no king, no lord, no bishop, only to the Pope, distant and far away. While nobles plotted and kings ruled, the Templars obeyed a different law. A law shaped behind cloistered walls and whispered in silent prayers to the common man. The Templars lived in another world. Their castles were fortified, yet quiet. Their movements were sudden, but always precise. They asked for nothing, yet owned vast lands. They answered no questions, yet held influence everywhere. Their white cloaks moved through cities without explanation. Their words were few, their eyes calm. This distance, this sense of being apart from the world, once inspired awe. But slowly, it became something else, something harder to name. In cities and towns, people began to whisper. Why were the Templars exempt from taxes? Why could no bishop inspect their churches? Why were they free to travel without toll or permission? The answers, hidden in papal documents and sacred rules, never reached the streets. All the world saw were men beyond law, walking in shadows. The Templars had become a brotherhood apart, not because they changed, but because the world around them no longer understood. Even the clergy, once their strongest allies, grew uneasy. Bishops who once praised them now questioned their reach. Priests who once blessed them now hesitated to speak. The Templars followed the rule, a rule few outside the order ever read. Their prayers, their customs, their way of life, all became part of a quiet mystery. The same silence that gave them peace now began to build a wall. And on the other side of that wall, suspicion waited. Oaths in the dark, every Templar began his life in the order with a ceremony. It was not held in public, nor announced with fanfare. It took place in the stillness of a chapel, behind heavy doors with only brothers present. The new knight would kneel. He would speak vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. He would swear never to retreat in battle. He would promise his life to the temple and to God. These were not ordinary words. They were sacred bonds. But outside the order, no one knew exactly what was said. As the years passed, those unseen rituals became the center of growing rumors. What did the Templars really swear to? Why were outsiders never allowed to witness the ceremony? Some whispered that they rejected the cross. Others said they worshiped strange idols. Some even claimed that new initiates were forced to spit on holy things, not as insult, but as a test of obedience. None of these stories were proven. But in a world ruled by faith, even a rumor could feel like truth. Their secrecy made them targets. Other knights took their vows in churches under public eyes, but the Templars preferred silence. Their ceremonies remained in the dark. Even their burial grounds were hidden. They did not mark their graves with crosses or names. Death, like life, was kept humble and hidden. In a world full of watching eyes, such secrecy was dangerous. Not because of what it proved, but because of what it allowed people to imagine. And when fear and imagination combine, facts no longer matter. The same vows that once held a man to honor now seemed like masks for something deeper. Something hidden, something dark. Fear of the invisible power seen is often feared, but power unseen is feared even more. The Templars, once poor and humble, had become rich. Their wealth did not lie in gold alone, but in paper, in records, ledgers, promises. They had invented systems of credit, held treasures for kings, managed estates across Europe. And with each transaction, they gained something less visible but more powerful: trust. That trust became influence, and influence became danger. Their commanderies held libraries, not of stories, but of secrets. Contracts, letters, coded documents, maps of trade routes, plans of fortresses, scrolls written in numbers few understood. The Templars were more than soldiers now. They were bankers, scholars, guardians of information. But with knowledge came suspicion. What were they writing? Who were they writing to? What did their symbols mean? To the outside world, these papers might as well have been spells. Their archives became legends. Some believed they held the secrets of Solomon's temple. Others thought they had uncovered lost books of magic. Some even believed they had found the Holy Grail, hidden not in stone, but in words. No one could prove it, but no one could disprove it either. This invisible power began to frighten those who once supported them. The Templars were everywhere, yet nowhere. Their wealth flowed across borders without coins changing hands. Their messages moved faster than kings. Their decisions were made in quiet halls, without armies, without noise. And so fear grew, not of swords, but of silence. Not of armor, but of parchment. In time, the people no longer saw guardians. They saw gatekeepers of things, too vast to understand. And the unknown, once sacred, now became dangerous. The seeds of conspiracy, it did not begin with war. It began with envy. Kings once in debt to the Templars began to look at them with new eyes. What had once been support now turned into resentment. How could a group of monks hold more land than barons? How could they move armies without royal approval? How could they lend money to monarchs and expect repayment with interest? In France, the air was thick with questions. King Philip IV, deeply in debt to the order, saw more than warriors. He saw a rival power. And in rivals, men often see enemies. He watched their castles. He questioned their secrets. He heard the rumors of strange rituals, of hidden gods, of unholy rites, and though he found no proof, he found a reason. That reason was fear. It is easy to turn suspicion into justice when power is at stake. And once the seeds of conspiracy are planted, they grow quickly. The people, already uneasy, began to listen. The church, pressured by kings, began to bend. And the silence of the Templars, once noble, once respected, became their greatest weakness. They did not defend themselves with words. They did not reveal their vows or their records. They stood by their rule, even as it became their shield and their prison. And so the mystery that once made them holy now made them targets. In time, the world would no longer see the cross on their chests. They would see shadows. The same silence that once connected them to God now left them alone before men. But the truth, the full truth, would remain buried in stone walls, forgotten books, and fading prayers. For the Templars, the beginning of the end came not with battle, but with whispers. Whispers that turned into fear, fear that became law, and law that carried the weight of ruin. And so, in the quiet corners of Europe, behind closed doors and locked gates, the first cracks appeared in a brotherhood, once thought unbreakable, not by swords, not by sin, but by the echo of questions never answered. Chapter 30. The King's Debt. The kingdom of France, proud and adorned with banners, stood quietly on the edge of desperation. The royal courts of King Philip IV were filled with elegance and ceremony, yet behind the walls of stone and gold, a darker truth was spreading. The crown was in debt, deep debt. Decades of war and conflict had drained the royal treasury like a leaky vessel. The king had fought with England. He had taxed the clergy. He had borrowed from nobles and merchants alike. Still, the kingdom's coin disappeared faster than it could be replaced. The battles may have looked like victories, but the cost behind them told a different story. King Philip, young, serious, and tightly wound, ruled with precision, but not peace. His reign was filled with heavy decisions, and each one carved away at the stability of his realm. The silver that once jingled in royal hands was now counted carefully, painfully. Soldiers needed to be paid, roads maintained, castles repaired. The people grumbled, the lords whispered, and through it all, Philip stared at the horizon, a man surrounded by power, yet shackled by need. The burden of royal debt did not sit quietly. It pressed on the king's shoulders like a cloak soaked in rain. Advisors warned of famine. Court treasurers urged more taxes. But there was a limit. Even a king could not endlessly squeeze a country already strained. France was beautiful, but it was bleeding, and Philip was looking for relief. Somewhere, in the cracks of his court and the long halls of his mind, the shape of a solution began to form. It would not be immediate, it would not be simple, but it would come. First, though, he had to look around and see who held what. He did not. Knights of Credit in the very heart of Paris stood a fortress unlike any other. Not a royal palace, not a noble manor, but a Templar stronghold. High walls surrounded it, but the real power was held deep within. Beneath stone and shadow, the Knights Templar kept their vaults, thick iron doors, guarded day and night, hiding gold, silver, documents, and secrets. Over the years, kings, merchants, and pilgrims had entrusted their fortunes to the Templars. The order had become something more than holy warriors. They were bankers, trusted, steady, silent. For King Philip, this presented a strange contrast. Outside his palace, the kingdom faltered under the weight of debt. Inside the Templar compound, wealth gathered like calm water behind a dam. There, books were tidy, their vaults full, and yet they paid no tribute to the crown. They owed him nothing. This balance, tilted so visibly, began to trouble the king. Once he had admired the Templars for their strength. He had even borrowed from them, but now that respect turned sour. Their independence, once a virtue, began to look like defiance. The Templars in Paris were disciplined and reserved. They asked for no favor. They interfered with no law. But they answered only to their own Grand Master and to the Pope. This made them untouchable, and to Philip, that made them dangerous. Their money was safe. Their structure was secure. Their reach extended beyond borders. In his mind, they had become more than knights. They were an empire within his own. And worse, one that he could not command. More than once, Philip's treasurer suggested he seek new loans from the Templars. But each time, the king's silence grew longer. It was not the idea of borrowing that disturbed him. It was the idea that he had to. Their wealth, resting quietly behind iron doors just streets away from his palace, felt like an insult. The money was there, but not his. The thin coin that could fund his army, repair his lands, and restore his glory, all locked away in Templar hands. In those quiet moments, Philip no longer saw allies. He saw obstacles. A dangerous ideas begin like whispers, soft, uncertain, and easily dismissed. But sometimes they grow. They curl through thoughts like smoke through stone, lingering where they do not belong. In the king's mind, one such idea began to take root. What if the Templars could be broken? Not in battle, but in power. What if their wealth could be seized, their control dismantled, their pride stripped away? What if they could be made to fall? It was not a thought Philip spoke aloud, not at first. But it followed him. It walked beside him through palace halls, echoed in the silence of treasury rooms, and waited outside the doors of council chambers. The Templars were strong, yes, but they were also exposed. They were visible. They were known. Their fame, their influence, their very symbols made them vulnerable. If someone were to challenge them, it would shake the world. But it could be done. Of course, there had to be a reason. No one could rise against the Templars without cause. They were sacred, after all, sworn to protect pilgrims, defenders of the faith. But power changes perception. And in Philip's eyes, their piety was beginning to look more like pride. Their discipline, like arrogance. Their silence, like secrecy. He began to wonder, were they truly holy anymore? Or had they grown too comfortable behind their walls of gold and stone? All it would take was a spark, a story, a charge. Something to stain their name in the eyes of the people. Once faith in them cracked, the rest could follow. The idea grew bolder. He would not simply ask for their gold. He would take it. He would not beg for their loyalty. He would erase their independence. And if the church hesitated, he would remind them that even popes needed kings. It was not just revenge. It was strategy, cold, simple, effective. In Philip's hands, the future was a map, and the Templars had become a mountain he was ready to move, planning a fall. The plan did not begin with swords. It began with parchment. Behind cathedral walls and in the still corners of royal chambers, the king's advisors moved like shadows. Letters were written, meetings held in hushed voices, accusations whispered, planted like seeds in the ears of bishops and judges. Slowly, a case was built. A case not of truth, but of convenience. The Templars were accused of strange rites, secret rituals, and heresy. None of it was proven. None of it needed to be. The mere suggestion was enough to stir fear. Philip did not act alone. He gathered loyal men, men who would not question, only obey. He appointed ministers to investigate the order even before any crime was named. He surrounded himself with those who understood the stakes. This was not just an act of ambition. It was a gamble. If it failed, the crown could fall. If it succeeded, the Templars would be undone in a single blow, not on the battlefield, but in the court of public opinion. The Church was a problem. Only the Pope could truly judge the Templars. So Philip pushed quietly, forcefully. He pressured, suggested, and warned. He had already quarreled with popes before. He knew how to bend Rome's will. And in time, the papal throne began to tilt. The support that had once guarded the order began to fade. Not because the Pope believed the charges, but because resisting Philip's will had become too dangerous. The blueprint of betrayal was nearly complete. Soldiers were positioned. Judges were chosen. Dungeons prepared. On a quiet October morning, in 1307, the trap would spring all at once across France. The Templars would be arrested, their properties seized, their leaders imprisoned. The king's debt would be erased not with repayment, but with ruin. And the people, confused and frightened, would be told a simple story that the order they once trusted had fallen into sin. It would be the end of an age, a fall not born of failure, but of fear. As the final preparations were made, Philip stood before the edge of history. The knights who once guarded Christendom would soon face its darkest judgment. Not by sword or spear, but by silence, paper, and betrayal. Chapter 14. The Night of Arrest. It was a morning like any other, the kind of morning that begins with stillness, cool air, soft light, the quiet echo of prayer rising through stone chapels. In monasteries across France, the Knights Templar woke to their daily rhythm. They washed in silence, walked the worn cloisters, and gathered for prayer beneath high vaulted ceilings. Nothing in the air suggested that the world was about to change, but it did. Before the sun was high, soldiers came. In every city, every village, every remote commandery, they moved with eerie coordination. France had never seen a sweep like this. Before, a kingdom moving against its own protectors with precision, doors were broken open, gates smashed. Men in white mantles with red crosses were taken from their beds, from their prayers, from their silence. They were not given time to gather their things. There were no explanations, only orders. The knights were chained, led out into streets that stared back in shock. Some were old, some young. All had taken vows. Many did not resist because they did not understand. They had not fallen in battle. They had not been defeated by an enemy's sword. They had been seized by their own king. It was Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that would echo for centuries. The day when faith and loyalty were twisted into suspicion. The day when the most disciplined order of knights in Europe was betrayed, not by outsiders, but by the very nation they had once protected. The accusations in the days that followed, the silence was filled with noise. Accusations spread like wildfire, whispered first, then shouted. They were strange, heavy with shadows and superstition. The Templars, it was claimed, had turned from God. They were accused of spitting on the cross, of denying Christ, of worshiping idols in secret chambers. There were stories of black cats, of bearded heads, of rituals in the dark. None of it fit the men who had prayed with folded hands, who had died defending pilgrims, who had built hospitals and guarded roads. But facts no longer mattered. King Philip IV of France, deep in debt to the Templars and hungry for their wealth, saw an opportunity. With the help of a few hand-picked informers and the power of a royal decree, he shaped a story. One where the order was not holy, but heretical. One where their treasure hid more than gold. The public, uncertain and uneasy, did not know what to believe. The Templars had always been distant, serious, disciplined, not like ordinary monks or knights. Their secrecy had once protected them. Now it made them vulnerable. The Pope, Clement V, hesitated. At first, he questioned the arrests. But the tide of pressure was strong. France's king had moved boldly, and to oppose him was dangerous. Over time, even the church began to listen to the noise. No trial had yet begun. But the image of the Templars, once white and clean, was already stained. The accusations, wild as they were, had done their work. A brotherhood was no longer honored. It was feared. Torture and confession in cold chambers beneath castles and towers, the silence returned. But it was not peaceful. It was the silence that follows a scream. The kind that lives in stone and straw and does not end when the fin of la main door is shut. The men who had once stood strong in battle now faced a different kind of enemy. Not swords, but ropes. Not arrows, but fire. They were stretched, beaten, starved, pressed under weights. And in those moments, when pain overcame prayer, they confessed. Some spoke words they did not believe. Others fell into silence so deep it could not be broken. A few refused to speak at all. Most simply tried to survive. The confessions, taken under duress, were recorded and sent to royal courts. These became the proof Philip needed. Words, once sacred, had become tools of destruction. What had begun in whispers now marched across. Parchment with the king's seal. Templars confessed to things they had never done, to crimes no one could witness. Their sacred vow of silence, once their greatest strength, was now used against them. Why did they not defend themselves? People asked. Why so quiet if they are innocent? But the silence was not guilt. It was what remained when trust was broken. The Templars had served loyally for nearly 2 centuries. And now they were alone, betrayed by rulers, abandoned by the church, misunderstood by the world they once protected. The torture did not end quickly. It lasted for months. Years in some places. Many Templars died in prison. Others went mad. And through it all, the world turned slowly, as if unsure what had truly happened. What had fallen was not just a brotherhood. It was a bond between faith and justice, between duty and honor. And no amount of confession, real or false, could change that. A kingdom cleansed by 1310, the damage was done. The Templar name, once spoken with reverence, now came with a pause, a question, an unease. The king had what he wanted. Their wealth was seized, their lands taken. Their image broken. France moved on. It told itself a story of cleansing, that the kingdom was purer now, safer, that heresy had been rooted out. But in truth, something precious had been lost. The church, caught in a web it could not fully escape, eventually disbanded the order. Pope Clement V, under pressure, dissolved the Knights Templar in 1312, not because they were proven guilty, but because their presence had become too dangerous, too controversial. In the years that followed, the fire spread. Other countries, England, Portugal, Spain, began to close Templar houses. Some did so reluctantly, others quickly. In places where no confessions were given, the knights were allowed to fade into other roles. In Portugal, they became the Order of Christ. In Spain, they joined other orders, but in France, the story ended with fire. In 1314, the last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was led to a stake on the River Seine. He had confessed. Under torture, then recanted. He had waited years for a fair trial. It never came. As flames rose around him, he called out not in fear, but in defiance. He claimed innocence. He forgave. And then, surrounded by smoke and stone, he was gone. France watched. The world watched. And then it turned away. But the wound remained. The betrayal could not be buried. The silence of the Templars, once sacred, now lingered in ghost stories and legends. Some said a curse had been spoken that day. Others whispered of treasures still hidden, of secrets buried beneath ancient chapels. Yet the truth was simpler. The Templars had trusted too deeply in the justice of kings and the mercy of the Church. And when that trust was broken, there was no one left to save them. Still, the memory endures, quiet, unshaken, waiting in the shadows of stone ruins and forgotten vaults. The brotherhood may have fallen, but its silence speaks still, of courage, of loss, and of a night when the world turned against its own protectors. Chapter 15, Trials of Fire. The Templars had once stood as guardians of the Holy Land, keepers of the sword and the cross. They had been praised by kings, honored by popes, and feared by their enemies. But now, in the cold stone chambers of Europe, their legacy was placed on trial, not by battle, but by ink and whisper, torchlight and fear. The era of honor was over. In its place came suspicion, greed, and silence. It began with a letter, then a secret arrest. In 1307, on an October morning, across France, hundreds of Templars were taken without warning. Their homes, commanderies, farms, fortresses were seized. Their records were confiscated, and their bodies were dragged before judges already told what to decide. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt and ambition, had struck that first blow. He needed gold, control, and a scapegoat. The Templars offered all three. The Church, hesitant but pressured, soon followed. Pope Clement V, caught between loyalty to truth and loyalty to kings, authorized inquiries under the weight of royal demand. But these were not trials in any honest sense. The verdicts were not in question, only the performances that would lead. There, the inquisitors, agents of both church and crown, entered with lists of charges and minds already closed. The accusations were strange, wild, and contradictory. Worship of false idols, spitting on the cross, secret rituals, heresy and silence. Each claim was a shadow shaped by fear. The Templars, long seen as disciplined and secretive, now found those same virtues twisted against them. Their silence became proof. Their devotion became doubt in dim chambers. Beneath the echo of dripping water and guarded doors, the interrogations began, not with calm inquiry, but with violence cloaked in holy robes. The Inquisition was not built to find truth. It was built to burn it away, slowly, until only ash remained. Words under duress, one by one. The brothers were brought in, shackled, starved, beaten. Some were old, their hair gray with years of service. Others were young, confused, and afraid. All were forced to speak, and when they did not, the pain worsened. Sleep was taken. Light was denied. Questions came like waves, and when answers failed, the torment deepened. Under these conditions, confessions came, strange, broken admissions whispered through cracked lips. Yes, some said, we denied Christ. Yes, we kissed forbidden things. Yes, we worshipped false gods. But the words were not true. They were drawn from suffering, not sin. And many who confessed recanted soon after, once their bruises healed, once their voices returned, but the damage was done. The confessions, copied by scribes, sealed with royal wax, were sent across Europe. What mattered now was not what was true, but what could be written and believed. The trials became theater, a slow play where truth had no lines, only roles assigned by power. Some brothers refused to speak, even as fire licked at their feet. Others begged for mercy, then wept when their pleas were ignored. In some towns, Templars stood in public squares and declared their innocence, only to be dragged away again. The cycle repeated: confession, recantation, punishment, silence. Over and over, until even those who listened could no longer tell which voice belonged to truth. The Templar order, once united by shared vows, now faced a trial where survival came at the cost of honor, and honesty was drowned in pain. The rooms of interrogation did not echo with justice. They echoed with screams. Europe divided. As word of the trials spread, Europe held its breath. Some kingdoms watched quietly, unsure. Others reacted with alarm. The Templars were not only warriors, they were landowners, bankers, diplomats, and spiritual leaders. Their fall would change the balance of power across the continent. In England, King Edward II hesitated. He had no love for Philip of France and doubted the charges. At first, he refused to arrest the Templars in his lands, but pressure grew. Letters arrived from the Pope. Rumors spread. Eventually, he relented, reluctantly and with delay. In Portugal and Aragon, the response was cautious. The rulers there questioned the motives behind the accusations. They saw through the mask of religion and found only politics beneath. Though investigations were opened, they were more measured, more careful. In some regions, the Templars were quietly protected, their lands renamed, their brothers absorbed into new orders. Their work continued, even if their name was erased. But in France, the fire burned brightest. King Philip pushed harder. He summoned councils. He demanded outcomes. He used the courts to break the order piece by piece. The Templars' wealth was seized. Their properties were handed to rivals or kept by the crown. Their defenders were silenced or ignored. The church, too, became a battleground. Pope Clement V wavered. He called for councils, delayed decisions, sought compromise. But in the end, he too yielded. The pressure was too great. The power of kings now overshadowed the pulpit. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, the Pope formally dissolved the Templar order, not through judgment, but by decree. No guilt was proven, no final confession required. The verdict came anyway, and so, across Europe, the Red Cross was lowered, not by enemies in war, but by the hands of those once called allies. The fall of the Templars was not a single event. It was a slow unraveling, thread by thread, of one of the most powerful brotherhoods the world had ever known. The martyrs burn in the final chapter of this long betrayal. The story narrowed to one man, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars. He had served faithfully for decades, through crusades and council, through storms and silence. Now he stood in chains, old but unbroken, a symbol of all that had been lost. He had confessed once under pain. But later, he spoke again, this time freely. And his words were clear. The Templars were innocent. The confessions were false. The charges were lies. He would not end his life in silence. The French crown, fearing his voice, moved quickly. On March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay was led to a small island on the Seine in Paris. There, with another high-ranking Templar beside him, he was tied to a stake. A crowd gathered. The fire was lit. It is said that he stood calmly, even proudly, as the flames climbed. His hands did not shake. His voice did not tremble. He spoke until the smoke took him. And what he said would echo long after. God knows. Who is wrong and has sinned? Soon there will be sorrow for those who condemned us. The fire crackled. The sky dimmed. The Seine flowed quietly beside it all. And above the city of Paris, the Red Cross faded into smoke. This was the end of the visible order. The knights, the fortresses, the wealth, all gone or taken. But something else remained. Not in banners, but in memory. In stories told in hushed tones. In whispers around fires. In symbols carved into old stones. The Templars had fallen, not in battle, but in betrayal. Yet their courage, their discipline, their devotion to something higher than power lived on. In the silence after the fire, in the spaces between the tietzes, between the tietzim, silence after the fire, in the silence after the fire, in the spaces between the sitzes, between the senzim, sitzimzim, the side pages of history, their light still flickers. Like a secret never quite lost. Like a prayer that still rises in the night. Chapter 16. The Curse of the Grand Master. It was March 18, 1314. The streets of Paris were unusually quiet. Not with peace, but with a heavy kind of stillness, the kind that presses against the skin like cold fog. People had gathered along the banks of the Seine, where the wind carried the scent of smoke and damp earth. A wooden scaffold stood on the island, Isle de la Cite, near the great cathedral of Notre Dame. Upon it, two stakes rose like bare trees waiting for fire. And walking slowly toward them was a man in white, barefoot, weathered, and unbending. Was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. For nearly 4 decades, he had led the order. Now he was a prisoner, accused of heresy and betrayal. But his face did not carry shame. It carried calm, the kind of calm that does not beg. The kind that does not bow. He had been imprisoned for, Years, tortured, pressed to confess things he never believed. At one point, broken by pain, he had agreed. But today, he stood free, not of chains, but of fear. He had retracted every forced word. And for that, there would be no mercy. The crowd watched as he reached the scaffold. The king's men stood by, silent. No grand ceremony, no trial here. Just the wood, the ropes, and the slow building of fire. Yet there was something sacred in his silence, a strange dignity. His white robe, once a symbol of command, now fluttered like a shroud. His beard, long and gray, stirred in the breeze. He looked out over the city, the same city where the Templars had once held power, respect, and fear, and then he turned to the flame, not away from it. He did not cry out. He did not kneel. He faced death the way he had faced life, with open eyes and a steady heart. Paris stood still as the fire was lit, and in the rising heat, a final moment was carved into history. A curse in the fire as the flames began to grow. A voice rang out, not loud, but clear enough to rise above the crackle of burning wood. It was the voice of Jacques de Molay. Bound to the stake, wrapped in smoke, he spoke not of forgiveness, nor fear, but of judgment. He called upon God to judge the men who had condemned the innocent. He named them King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V. He said they had twisted truth, betrayed trust, and destroyed the order for their own gain. Then he said something that would never be forgotten. He declared that both the king and the pope would stand before God within the year. Not in time's slow course, but soon, within the very breath of months. It was not a scream. It was not madness. It was the final oath of a man who had nothing left to lose. And as the fire rose higher, swallowing his body, his words burned. Brighter than the flame, witnesses stood frozen. Some claimed to have heard the exact words. Others remembered only the weight of them. But the message spread quickly. From the Seine to the hills of France, whispers moved like wind. The Grand Master had cursed the king and the pope, and then something strange began to happen. A month later, Pope Clement V fell ill. He died in agony, far from Rome, unable to find rest. His body, it is said, was so poorly buried that wild animals reached it before it could be moved. And before the year's end, King Philip IV suffered a sudden stroke while hunting. He died in October, his face twisted and his name unsettled. Just as Jacques de Molay had said, people began to wonder. Had the Grand Master spoken a prophecy? Or had something darker taken root? A curse born not of hatred, but of injustice, forged not in magic, but in the silence of betrayal? Echoes and legends, the story of Jacques de Molay did not end in ashes. It began there. For once his voice had vanished into the smoke, it rose again in legend. Across France, across Europe, the tale grew. The curse became a symbol of wrongs unanswered, of powers unchecked, of secrets too sacred to die. Some said that de Molay had touched an ancient power, one buried deep beneath the Temple Mount, passed down in silence and bound to his blood. Others believed that his final words were simply the judgment of God, proof that heaven saw what men had done. And others still claimed the Templars had guarded something too holy for kings, too dangerous for popes, and that this was their punishment for keeping it hidden. In time, new stories joined the old. That the Templars had left behind a book of knowledge, and that whoever read it would meet the same fate. that the Grand Master's soul still walked the places where his brothers fell, that the order, though broken in name, had never truly ended. In taverns and cloisters, in the halls of scholars, the fire of the curse continued to burn. Even centuries later, the echo remained. Napoleon was said to have studied Templar secrets. Some claimed the Freemasons were born from surviving knights. In every age, the myth returned, reshaped, retold, but never eased. The truth became hard to find, but the feeling, the shadow of the curse, never faded. Because sometimes, when justice dies in silence, the silence itself begins to speak. The brotherhood ends, or does it? With the death of Jacques de Molay, the Templar order was declared finished. Its lands were seized. Its records were scattered or destroyed. Its churches were handed over to others. The brothers who remained alive were absorbed into different lives, some into other monastic orders, some into exile, some simply vanished. The white mantles were folded away. The red crosses faded. The rule of the temple fell quiet, but the question has always remained: did the order truly end? Some believe that in Portugal, the knights found a way to survive, reborn under a new name with the same vow in their hearts. Others think that fragments of the brotherhood went underground, their secrets buried with them, passed from one generation to the next. And in remote valleys, old stones still bear marks that resemble the Templar cross. In dusty libraries, letters surface that hint at meetings long after the order was broken. And on quiet mountaintops, there are places where no flag flies, but the silence feels like memory. Perhaps what survived was not the structure, but the spirit. A way of life, once bound by oath and fire, now carried quietly in stories, symbols, and dreams. The Templars may have died in law, but legends live beyond laws. And legends, once born, rarely sleep. In the end, the curse of the Grand Master may not have been a punishment. It may have been a final mirror held up to those who thought they could shape truth with swords and seal justice with smoke. And as time passed, that mirror did not crack. It reflected still dots, so when night falls over the Seine and the moonlight touches the stones of Paris, some say you can still feel it, the echo of steps on old cobblestone, the flicker of a cloak. In the dark, the whisper of a vow too sacred to die. The order was burned, but not forgotten. Chapter 17, Scattered in Silence. The year was 1312, and the once mighty order of the Knights Templar had been officially disbanded. But when an order falls, it does not simply vanish. It lingers, not just in stone and scripture, but in people. The Templar knights, monks, and servants who had once moved with certainty across continents now found themselves scattered by fear and politics. But they did not all fall into ruin. Some crossed borders, some changed their names, some disappeared into silence so deep it would take centuries to hear from them again. In many parts of Europe, sympathy for the Templars still existed. Not all kings had shared Philip IV's hunger or suspicion, and in those gentler places, many former brothers found quiet refuge. The Hospitallers, another great military order sworn to protect pilgrims, took in some of the Templar survivors. Though they wore different colors and answered to different leaders, they shared enough in tradition and mission that the transition felt, at least to some, like a continuation. These knights were absorbed not only for their skill, but for their silence. They did not protest. They did not rebel. They simply vanished into new roles, their past left behind like a book closed too soon. Others found their way to the remote ends of Europe, to quiet monasteries tucked in green valleys, hidden behind the walls of silence and stone. These places did not ask questions. They offered bread, prayer, and a chance to disappear. A former Templar knight could shave his beard, trade his sword for a rosary, and become just another monk among many. And so they faded, not into death, but into stillness. These were the lucky ones, those who found peace in the aftermath, but there were also those who fled. Across rivers and mountains, they moved under cover of night, hunted by men who once called them brother. In places like Aragon and Hungary, they were sometimes welcomed quietly. A few carried records, others carried nothing at all. They had become ghosts, men without titles, homes, or banners. Yet still, in their silence, they carried a name that once struck awe. The Templars had not all died. They had scattered, and in scattering, they had planted something new. The Order of Christ Portugal was a land apart, not only in language and coastlines, but in how it treated the broken pieces of the Templar legacy. While France had cast the order into darkness, Portugal did something different. It looked at the Templars, their discipline, their structure, their loyalty, and saw something still valuable. King Denis of Portugal, a wise and careful ruler, refused to let the full weight of Philip IV's plan fall across his land. He saw not heretics, but skilled men of service. And so he made a choice that would echo for centuries. In 1319, just a few years after the official end of the Templars, a new order was founded in Portugal, the Order of Christ. It was on paper a fresh beginning, a new name, a new rule. But beneath the surface, it was a shelter. Many of the former Templars who had lived and worked in Portugal were welcomed into this new order. The Church approved it. The Pope gave his blessing. And so, without war or fire, the Templar flame was quietly passed to a new torchbearer. The Order of Christ built new headquarters, but many of its first knights had once worn the Red Cross. Their vows were similar. Their mission echoed the old. They defended the realm, supported the crown, and managed lands and estates with the same discipline they had once used in the Holy Land. Portugal, small though it was, had become a sanctuary, a place where the Templar spirit could survive, not in shadow, but in light. Over time, the Order of Christ would help fund Portugal's age of exploration. The very ships that sailed to Africa, India, and beyond were guided, in part, by charts and support from the Order. Their symbol, a new version of the Red Cross, was painted on sails that braved unknown oceans. The Templars, it seemed, had not ended. They had evolved. Though the name was different, the legacy flowed on. In Portugal, the Brotherhood lived not as a myth, but as a part of the state, strong, respected, and reborn. Whispers of survival beyond the borders of kingdoms and the safety of royal favor, other stories took root. These were not written in books or confirmed by popes. They were carried by word of mouth, passed between travelers, whispered in taverns, and echoed in forgotten valleys. Stories of Templars who had escaped not just punishment, but history. Stories of ships that had sailed from France just before the mass arrests, vanishing into fog with treasure aboard. Stories of knights who had crossed into Scotland, welcomed by a nation at odds with Rome, and allowed to settle far from the reach of French justice. In Switzerland, too, rumors bloomed. It was said that former Templars had offered their skills to mountain communities, teaching discipline, defense, and governance. Some even believed that the early structures of Swiss militia and law bore traces of Templar influence. There was no proof, only patterns, lines that connected silently, waiting for someone to notice. Then came the myths of hidden treasure, gold buried beneath Templar commanderies, sealed away before the fall. Some said it was in the Pyrenees. Others claimed it rested in catacombs beneath Paris, guarded by secrets and symbols. These tales were often wild, but they captured the imagination. The Templars had always moved through mystery. In death, that mystery only grew. There were even those who believed the Templars had never truly ended, that they had gone underground, forming secret chapters that continued the old mission in quiet. Lodges, codes, signs known only to the true initiated. These legends would live on through centuries, inspiring fiction, fear, and fascination. The idea that somewhere, in the still places of the world, the Red Cross still waited, unseen, unbroken, became a story many wanted to believe. These whispers were not history. They were not facts, but they were something else, a memory that refused to fade, a story still unfolding. And in that, perhaps, they held a different kind of truth. A flame in the dark, the order was gone, yet not forgotten. Its castles crumbled or were claimed, its vaults emptied, its name condemned by kings and councils. But the spirit, the strange fusion of prayer, discipline, and purpose did not die. In quiet corners of Europe, it lingered. In the symbols carved above old doors, in the ruins watched by farmers and monks, in the records that scholars still studied. The Templars had been scattered, but their mission, whatever it had truly become, left a mark too deep to erase. What made the Templars unique was not just their military skill or their vast wealth. It was their sense of purpose. They believed they were serving something higher, not just a pope or a king, but an ideal, a sacred duty. That belief, once held by thousands, cannot be buried by a decree. It echoes, and sometimes, in unexpected ways, it lights new paths. In the centuries that followed, movements arose that borrowed from Templar structure, new orders, fraternal societies, secret groups built around loyalty and shared values. Most had no direct connection to the original Knights, but the inspiration remained. The Templar story became a well from which others would draw, not for war, but for meaning. Even in modern times, the Red Cross lingers, on flags, on churches, in stories told to wide-eyed listeners by candlelight. They are tales of courage and betrayal, of faith and fall. They are quiet reminders that no mission, once believed in deeply enough, ever truly dies. And so, the flame in the dark still flickers. It moves with the wind, gentle but sure. The Knights Templar may no longer ride across deserts or guard the gates of Jerusalem, but in the stillness of history, in the soft hush before sleep, they are not forgotten. Their story, scattered like ash across time, still glows, faintly, softly, endlessly. Chapter 18. A legacy that will not die. Across the hills of Europe and the dry earth of the Levant, ruins remain, fragments of walls that once stood strong, towers now softened by time. These old stones, weathered and broken, no longer hold swords or brothers. They are quiet now. Birds nest in the corners. Grass pushes between cracks. And yet, as you walk past them, something lingers. Not sound, not movement, but memory. The castles of the Templars were more than fortresses. They were symbols of courage, of faith, of order in a time of chaos. Today, their stone is crumbling, but their story has only grown stronger. What they built in silence, history now echoes. What once stood behind thick walls now travels through words and dreams. Their tale is retold in countless ways, in books of history, in whispers of myth, in the pages of novels and the scenes of films. Some speak of treasure hidden deep beneath ruined chapels, others of secret rites and unbroken bloodlines, and still others speak only of duty, of men who believe they were called to serve something greater, even when the world turned against them. Their story moves between truth and imagination, between fact and faith. But even when blurred by centuries, it does not vanish. Each telling keeps them alive. In libraries and candlelit rooms, around campfires and quiet studies, the Templars rise again, not as soldiers now, but as symbols. Their stone has fallen, but their story still stands. And maybe that is the greater strength. A wall can fall, a tower can be torn down, but a story, when rooted deep in the soul of a people, can live forever. The first modern institution, long before modern banks opened their doors, the Templars had already written the rules. Long before standing armies marched with command and code, they had practiced it. And long before ideas of international law and global networks took hold, the Templars had lived them quietly and without fanfare. They were not just knights. They were organizers, architects, and administrators. Their orders stretched across continents, tied together not by borders, but by belief. In every country where they held land, they maintained records, detailed, disciplined, consistent. They managed estates, negotiated treaties, balanced ledgers. Their network of commanderies served as early versions of embassies, supply stations, and financial centers. For pilgrims, the Templars offered letters of credit, simple papers that allowed a traveler to deposit money in one land and withdraw it in another without carrying coins through danger. This was banking before banks, and it worked. For kings, the Templars provided loans, handled treasury funds, and even stored royal jewels. For communities, they managed agriculture, hired workers, oversaw construction. They knew how to build and how to plan, not just in battle, but in peace. Their rules were written, their decisions recorded. Their chain of command was respected across languages and cultures. In many ways, they laid the groundwork for institutions that would rise long after them: nations, corporations, financial systems, and perhaps that is why they were feared at the end. Not because of their swords, but because of their structure. They were the future, hidden inside the past. And for a moment in time, they held the keys to something far larger than they knew, a world that was still being born. A symbol reclaimed when the Templars fell, their name did not disappear. It slipped underground into the soil of legend. But like a buried seed, it returned, different, reshaped, but alive. In the centuries that followed, many groups claimed a link to them. Some were real, others were stories. The Freemasons, rising in later ages, took inspiration from their rituals, their secrecy, their symbols. Whether a direct line exists is still debated. But the shadow of the Templars moved through the lodge halls, just as it moved through art and imagination. In novels and poems, they became protectors of ancient secrets. In paintings, a red cross stood bold against white cloaks. In modern culture, they became puzzles, clues, mysteries waiting to be solved. From dusty cathedrals to digital screens, the Templar image was reborn. And yet, through all these retellings, something deeper remained. Not just a fascination with mystery, but a longing for meaning. The Templars stood for discipline in a world of disorder, for belief in a time of uncertainty, for unity in a fractured age. Those ideals, even when wrapped in fiction, still call to something quiet inside us. The Red Cross, once stitched on the shoulders of warrior monks, now appears in games, books, movies, and symbols worn without armor. It is no longer about conquest. It is about memory. It is about the power of an idea to survive, even when the men who carried it are gone. Symbols change. But when a symbol is tied to sacrifice, purpose, and myth, it endures. The Templar cross endures. What remains, all stories must end, even the greatest ones. The Templars were betrayed, scattered, and silenced. Their lands were taken. Their names forgotten by law. But what they lived for, and what they left behind, cannot be taken by time. In quiet corners of churches, old stones still bear their marks. In fields where castles once stood, wind still moves through places once guarded by prayer. And in the hearts of those who still believe in duty without reward, in courage without audience, something of the Templars remains. It is not about swords. It is not about secrets. It is about the spirit that rises when men and women dedicate themselves to something sacred, something higher than gain, greater than fear. The Templars lived in a world of dust and war, of kings and chaos. But they carved into that world a space for discipline, for faith, for shared purpose. That space is still there. Maybe not in stone, but in soul. Even now, when the world feels fast and unsteady, their legacy speaks. It reminds us that strength can be quiet, that loyalty can be sacred, that to live with honor, even in defeat, is to never truly fall. Their story is not just history. It is a mirror showing us who we were, who we are, and who we might become again. So let the candles burn. Let the stones remain. Let the Red Cross, in whatever form it takes, remind us that though fire may consume the body, it cannot destroy what was built in belief. The Knights Templar are gone, but their legacy, their myth, their memory, their meaning will not die.